If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
People who believe they have encountered a cryptid, such as a crawler, Goatman, Bigfoot, not deer, etc. Which one did you see, and what's your story?
Mimic encounter. This happened last summer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I went out for a walk around 8 or 9. I was walking on a street with a big park on one side and a couple baseball diamonds surrounded by forests on the other. I wasn't particularly paranoid or on high alert or anything. I stopped under a streetlight to light a cigarette, and for some reason the forest across the street caught my attention. I don't really know how to explain it. Anyway, I kept walking until the forest part I was watching was right across the street from me and stopped. I was just looking at it, and all of a sudden I heard my girlfriend's voice come from the forest saying, "Hi." Really happy like. I knew my girlfriend was still at home, so I just did what I thought would be best and ignored it and kept walking. I was kind of creeped out. After I got a block or so away, I turned around and saw a really tall, dark silhouette stand up from behind a minivan parked down the street. I was officially scared, and I ran all the way home. It was pretty creepy, but it kicked off a bunch of messed up stuff that started happening to me for the next several months. I had a weird experience when I was 12 or so. My sister, who is a year younger, a friend who lived a block over of the same age, and I were exploring this forest area that ringed a marshy prairie. We were just sitting on some logs and looking out over the prairie marsh woods as the sun was setting, and this little figure popped up. I swear to whatever powers that be, it was only a couple feet high, walking through the grass with a pointy hat. The sun was setting, kind of being him, or maybe her? So I couldn't make out a lot of color. But they kind of strolled around for a couple minutes while we all grabbed each other's hands and stared for a few minutes. I started saying, "Oh my God. Oh, what the? Oh my God." I must have been muttering my disbelief loudly because I hit a louder syllable and it froze, then ducked into the grass and was gone. We were all blown the duck away, and I still swear that I believe in gnomes. How can I not? One of the strangest experiences in my life. Strange encounter in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Me and my girlfriend were on a camping trip to the Upper Peninsula, checking out some of where she grew up and taking me to her favorite tourist destinations between our nights of camping for about a week during the end of summer, spanning from mid to late August of 2024 to be exact. About halfway through, we stopped at the pictured rocks to camp right along the shore in a, to my knowledge, semi-popular campground. All of the campsites were spread out pretty decently, in the midst of all the trees. Each clearing was about 40 to 50 feet from each other, lining the hill that leads to the shore of Lake Superior. Now this was in the very top of Michigan, where outside of the handful of other campers there, almost nobody lives. I mean, in comparison to anywhere else I've been, there is a significant lack of people. So when nightfall hit and we waited in our tent talking and playing board games until long into the night, around 2 a.m. we walked out of our tent to try to look at the stars where the shore starts. I wish we hadn't. Walking out towards the clearing through the forest, long past seemingly any other camper had been awake. We traveled only about 30 feet toward the shore to the little clearing we had planned out. As mentioned, the line of campers of where other people should be is far to either the left or right side of me. So why was it that we heard what I've tried to rationalize to a blood-curdling scream of a disheveled man, as if a man was being killed? From behind us, from the direction of our only illusion of safety being a tent. Now me and my girlfriend, thinking this would be a small romantic and calm walk, didn't think to put on her knee braces for her healing legs, as they had recently dislocated. We couldn't run. I put my arm around her shoulders, and we had to slowly and painstakingly walk through this sudden burst of horror to our flimsy tent. Both of our minds were racing. We tried staying calm, comforting each other by saying maybe it was someone camping outside the main sites. Maybe they had a nightmare? Got attacked by an animal? Got scared by their friend? Firstly, if someone were there at all being a stretch, it likely wouldn't be wolves because we would have heard a howl or traveling pack, right? And bears tend to avoid people when possible, so unless someone left food out and camped next to our site, what are even the chances of that? Even then, after all of our racing thoughts trying to get around the same idea, I couldn't stop thinking. From every piece of research I've done, from any rabbit hole I've gone down, it just seemed wrong. The sudden silence to the insects, the sudden chill of the wind, the darkness seeming just darker, I couldn't stop it, I couldn't shake it. It didn't sound human, it was an intelligible yes, and you could definitely hear a no being yelled. However, it rather sounded like something attempting to sound humane. Too raw, too distorted, too static. While I may be a paranoid person, this just felt so incredibly wrong. Is there any chance of this being some kind of more paranormal creature? My friends think I'm crazy, and honestly, maybe I am. Apologies if I've rambled too much, I just wanted to make sure I gave the story the context and justice I think it deserves. No idea what this could be, I'm just hoping to get help from wherever I can. Thanks for listening, and please reach out if you might know anything. Rural South Georgia, U.S., 2008. My grandma died, and I drove from college to meet my family. I arrived at my grandma's house to find out everybody had gone to my aunt's house. I looked out into the field behind her house and saw a huge black cat slowly advancing at me from the middle of it. Solid black, long, thin tail that pointed up, the size of a large dog, moved just like a house cat though. Looked about 75 to 100 pounds. Way bigger than a bobcat. It was close enough that there was no mistaking it for anything other than a big cat. I got a rifle out of my trunk and shot the ground in front of it. It ran into the tree line and disappeared. To this day, my family thinks I made the whole thing up. The state government still insists they don't exist. Plenty of people have seen them, though. So this happened this evening. Bigfoot. Indeed, my wife believes I'm insane. I had my first encounter, so to speak, about 3 hours ago. This is southeast Oklahoma, not far from Kavanaugh Hill. I had come back from our storage unit getting some winter clothes out to bring home. As I returned home, I pulled into our driveway, killing the lights as I always do. I parked at the far side of the circle drive opposite the house. There are some shrubs, tall grass, grown up etc. on a burn pile next to the circle drive, then it opens up with a couple of pecan trees and flower producing bushes of different sorts, and then about 15 yards beyond that is a barbed wire fence. So I pull in and park, get out, and I smelled an awful kind of wet dog skunk smell that I didn't think too much about because we had been smelling this smell off and on for the last few weeks and believed we just had a skunk around, but it was strong, so I just believed a skunk was closer, but it wasn't like overpowering or anything, so it wasn't a big deal. Well, I walk around the front of the truck, and as soon as I reach to put my hand on the door handle, I hear an extremely low growl, not like a dog growl, it was lower, almost like a with a very, very deep, low raspy voice sound that was a completely different sound I've never heard. As I hear this, the hair on my neck and all over my body stand on end and goosebumps bad, and I freeze briefly. I've lived in the country all my life and have never heard anything like it by any animal, and out of the corner of my eye is a very, very large silhouette about 12 to 15 yards from me. Just on my side of the fence behind the first pecan tree. It was an extremely wide silhouette, and if I'm guessing about 8 to 9 feet tall. Just a massive figure, but I could not make anything else out as far as certain features. It was in the dark, and slowly, in a single fluid motion, it eased back further and more behind the tree. I about SHT myself being quite honest, but I acted like I didn't see it. I opened the door and grabbed the clothes, and when I shut the door, I noticed the figure was gone, and I walked on around the truck and made my way inside. Now I am of the same mind as the next person and am not on drugs, nor have I had any alcohol beverages this evening. My wife asked me what was wrong, and I just said nothing until we came to bed, and I told her, and she all but laughed at me. But, here we are, she's asleep, and I'm typing this up while I can't hardly believe what happened still. I just don't know what to make of it. I'm still pretty freaked out over it as well. This legit just happened, and the first time ever to me. Thoughts? I actually have a story for this. Happened in East Central Alabama about 40 years ago, when I was about 19 or 20. I'm 5 feet 2 inches and at the time weighed about 95 pounds, this is relevant later. I had a nephew a few years younger than me who was more like a kid brother. I was a country girl, I spent my years up until then roaming around in the woods, encountering plenty of wild animals, etc. I offered to take my nephew fishing early one morning at a somewhat remote pond near my childhood home. We set up on the bank about 30 feet apart, with a small, bushy tree in between us, so we were out of sight of each other. We're happily fishing and enjoying a beautiful, sunny spring morning when my nephew suddenly says, "Aunt Kuzakat, what is that in the water?" I looked up to see a huge, snake-like head sticking up out of the water and cruising by about 20 feet from the bank. I dropped my rod right there, yelled, "What in the hell is that?" and started backing up the bank, keeping my eyes locked on whatever it was. It heard me, its head snapped around in my direction, then it turned away and dove. A long stretch of shiny brown body arched out of the water behind it before it disappeared. My nephew, now frightened, dropped his rod and ran over to me, as I'm frantically trying to look for any sign of the creature and checked the farther bank to see if I saw it come out over there. Past the spot I was standing, the bank was overgrown with small trees and bushes, so it could have come ashore invisibly just a few feet from us. We grabbed our stuff and hightailed the car to get out of there. At first, all I saw was a silhouette, as the sun was still relatively low and shining across the pond. It was a streamlined, hence snaky looking, head nearly as big as mine, sticking up out of the water on several inches of neck nearly as big as the head. Nothing else was visible, and it was just cruising along without splashing or making much noise. When it turned and dove, the angle of the light changed enough that I could see it was brown. It seemed to take forever for the body to disappear, so it was long and looked nearly as big around as I was. The rear end never surfaced. I was really shaken, as I had, and still have, no idea what we saw. My first reaction was giant snake, but of course there's no snake that big, especially in Alabama. The creature was swimming with its head held erect, out of the water, and it was swimming very smoothly without disturbance. It dove to get away, so it was comfortable holding its breath and swimming underwater. And the pond has no real connection with larger bodies of water. It was originally dug to drain a swampy area in the middle of the woods and just has a small stream draining out of it. The only thing I can think of that might fit the bill is a river otter, which are rare in these parts, and how did one end up in a small pond in the middle of the woods, many miles from any river or large body of water? I'm baffled, and it still bothers me 40 years later. What animal did we see? And, if it was an otter, how and why did a huge otter end up in such a remote pond? Nothing spectacular like Bigfoot or anything, but when I was a kid, me and my friends were playing army in the woods near my grandparents' house in rural Kentucky. I was like 13 or 14. Anyway, I was keeping hidden from the enemy by crawling through some really high grass. Looked down and saw the biggest damn caterpillar I've ever witnessed in my life. Like about 3/4 the length of my forearm casually crawling in front of me. It looked like what we call a woolly bear. Big, fat, and hairy with the black and orange stripes. The size literally frozen me. I came to my senses and jumped up to go get my buddies, but we never found it. I've looked up caterpillar species since then and have never stumbled upon anything nearly as large as this thing was. Maybe not an actual cryptid in the classical sense, but it was definitely something that disturbed me, and since I've never seen anything like it again, I'm going to consider it my own personal brush with a monster. It's very, very alien and strange. No cryptids for me. Couple family members who think they've seen Bigfoot though. I don't believe them, but more due to them loving beer and driving home late at night, which I don't condone, rather not it being Bigfoot, who knows what's out here in the woods, but I do have a story of an unknown animal. So where I live, there are heavily wooded areas surrounding a large area of farmland. Pretty rural, definitely nothing in the county that resembles a city by most people's definition. Due to this, we have a plethora of predatory animals in the area, be it coyotes, wild dogs, wolves, the occasional wolverine, bears, bobcats, cougars, etc. So one day after school, early college, I was driving home on the secondary route home, slightly longer but it passes through a small town with a market I like to stop by for soda and sunflower seeds. After a pit stop at the market, I was coming out of the second little town on the route, a route I have driven easily over 1,000 times in my life, so the roads and the usual sights are not unfamiliar to me, and this big, feline-like animal ran across the road in front of me from a small thicket of cottonwoods into a field, probably 30 to 70 feet in front of me, close enough that I slowed down but didn't have to slam on my brakes, and just kept running. It was booking too, not car speed or anything, but definitely faster than I could run, or maybe even an average dog could run. Normally I'd think it was a cougar. I've seen them in the area before, one even on my own property, but it didn't look quite right. It was much darker than any cougar I've seen, almost like a dark mastiff's coloring. It did definitely seem like fur to me though, not skin, so I don't think it had mange. Granted, it was like 50 feet in front of me though, so I could be wrong. Its tail was a bit skinnier than what cougars look like as well, and, this being the oddest detail about it when comparing it to a cougar, its hind legs seemed longer than a cougar's and seemed higher set on its body. It didn't look especially alien or anything, just like some sort of large feline animal, but it didn't look like anything I know of in the area either. So this was kind of passed down from uncle to dad to me. One night when my uncle and his friend were just hanging out, it was nighttime. So they hear trash can get knocked over and a loud thunk against the house. Uncle runs outside and sees what he assumes is a goofy kid. The kid runs around the corner, he runs after the kid. He runs over, and he sees its silhouette against the night sky. It's up on the fence. He said he felt a huge unease when he saw it, now it's in it. He didn't see much but a dark shape, but the light from a window on the side of the house revealed a foot wrapped around the top of the fence. He said the foot was hairy and made him cringe by how it gripped the fence. Then it ran off. Real encounter? Heck, if I know, but it's definitely fun to tell. The monster on Marley Road. My dad told me a story he experienced as a child. and yesterday I called the other person present in his story, and she told the same story with little differential in details. As far as anyone can ever investigate, this story is true and complete. In the late 1970s, my dad, Stephen, was staying up north in Michigan's Lower Peninsula. Night was approaching, and he and his friends Connie and Cindy were trying to make Kool-Aid but didn't have any sugar. They decided to go to a friend's house to get some sugar, but being that this is the countryside of Michigan, the houses were distant from one another. The friend's house was a quarter mile or more from the place they were staying. They brought their dog Dandy, a large countryside Great Dane that was very familiar with the forests, tough as nails, and afraid of nothing. They reached the friend's house with no issues, and as they were leaving with their newfound sugar, the friend's pet raccoon was following them away from the house. Cindy noticed this and told them she was going to run back to the house to return the raccoon and catch back up with them. Stephen, Connie, and Dandy continue on for a very short distance when, out of the bushes on the left of the road, a creature walks out, heading across the street. Dandy started to growl and run towards it. As Dandy approached this creature walking across the street, it turned to face the three and seemingly stood up. Upon this, Dandy stopped, turned around, and ran full speed right past Stephen and Connie. Usually a big dog, especially a Great Dane, would fight to the death to protect their owner, but whatever this was in the road had Dandy so frightened that she blew past them like they were just another set of trees in the forest. After Dandy abandoned the two, they turned around and ran as fast as they could. While running, Stephen looked back and saw the creature lunge from the middle of the road into the weeds on the right side of the road. They regrouped with Cindy at the friend's house, so terrified by what they just experienced. Cindy ended up having to coax Stephen, Connie, and even Dandy to walk back down Marley Road to their home. Stephen recalls the creature being quadrupedal, looking tall and thin, almost like a deer, but says there is no possible way Dandy would have been afraid of a deer. Connie's recollection of the story has slight differences. She does not remember Dandy running towards the creature. She thinks the moment Dandy saw it, she turned and ran. Connie also claims they did not run immediately. She believes they stood frozen in fear as the creature slowly sulked across the road until it walked into the weeds on the right, only running once it had finally passed and had not noticed them. Her description of the creature was a tall, hairy, bipedal creature with long arms that dragged or nearly dragged the ground. She later would be shown a picture of the fabled Dogman of Michigan and said this was the closest to what she remembers seeing. Me and my good friend live really close together near a deserty mountainy area, and one of our favorite things we used to do was go hiking in the mountains in the middle of the night. We both were walking up the mountain at 2 a.m., and everything was completely silent and dark. All of a sudden we hear the most horrifying screams we've ever heard. Just totally disturbing shit, like a woman was being murdered. As soon as we heard it, we both looked at each other in fear and decided to start walking back home. Halfway back down the mountain, the screaming slowly stopped. He was too scared to walk back home by himself, so he just spent the night. The whole night we were trying to figure out what it was. We joked that it was La Llorona or the Chupacabra. After doing some research, we determined that it was probably a mountain lion, as the area we were in has sightings of mountain lions walking the streets often, and mountain lions scream like that sometimes. We still walked the streets at night but stopped hiking up the mountains after that. That was probably the closest and scariest cryptid/unknown beast experience I've been a part of, and I don't take cryptids seriously. When I was a child, I used to live in a subdivision that had an 18-hole golf course in the middle of all the houses. I would often go out on the golf course when golfers would leave or when golfing was highly uncommon. There was a forest in the middle of the golf course that was always eerily quiet and was genuinely spooky. We tended to steer clear of going any further from the edge because of that fact. One day, I was supposed to meet some of my friends at our base, which was at the edge of the forest, so I was making the trek alone to meet them. It was probably about midday in the summer. I recall there being overcast and looking like it might rain, so we knew golfers wouldn't be around. I was not too far off and could see the edge of the forest about 500 feet away. I was in the middle of the fairway when I stopped because I saw something strange out of the corner of my eye move to my right. Also about 400 to 500 feet away, I saw something I have never witnessed before, nor since. It was a huge, grayish/white deer with small antlers, standing at the edge of the fairway as well as next to a large tree. I frozen, staring at it from afar, and it stared back at me. The strangest thing that I remember about this encounter was the long sound it made and what occurred after it. It literally sounded like whales communicating long distances, but was extremely loud in my ears for coming from at least a few hundred feet away. Extremely frightened, I started running away, but within a few seconds of beginning my flight, I remember looking back to see if it was chasing me, but it vanished, increasing my fear and speed away. I remember telling people this right after it happened, but nobody believed me. I think the consensus was that it was in my head. One time, while I was sleeping, I heard a loud pop, similar to a firecracker but not quite as loud. I thought it might have been my computer / some sort of electrical short, so I woke up and looked at my computer to see if there was a fire or something. I didn't see anything in the dark, so I relaxed and shifted to lay on my back to go back to sleep, looking up at the ceiling. Within a couple seconds, I started to notice some sort of vague, shadowy figure, as if it were standing next to my bed and waving a hand over me. I've seen shapes like this before, so I watched the hand out of curiosity. Then, the hand went away, and I felt the side of my bed dip down, as if something was pushing down on it. The movement was slow enough not to frighten me yet firm enough to be clearly felt. This was surprising, but I wasn't scared. I looked to where the shadow was standing, and out from the dark, for a brief moment, a reptilian-looking humanoid appeared there, wearing a plain and slightly loose shirt and holding a clipboard with his left hand and holding a pen or something in his right, as if making a note. His head was in profile to me, turned to his left, so I was looking at the right side of his face. His eye stood out to me the most. He looked concerned, had a round pupil, was fairly large in size, and was almost cartoony looking but kind. I could see scales outlined on his skin, and he had larger scales along his prominent brow. He had a smallish sort of beak / nose, and it looked like his upper lip covered down to his bottom jaw, aka no discernible lips / mouth. His shoulders were very broad, more broad than most humans, and he seemed a bit shorter than a typical human, if I had to guess. I didn't see anything below where his elbows sat around his midsection, so I don't know what his legs or feet looked like. The way it looked was like he and his details were outlined in the lights you see when you press on your eyes. That kind of greenish / yellowish / lightly rainbowy look. Quite bright in the dark but still kind of faint. It was very brief, like a second, but very detailed and in the center of my vision. I have no idea what to make of it, but I'll never forget it. I tried drawing him once, but unfortunately I don't have it with me. I wonder a lot about it. This was in 2009, I would have been 21. A couple years back, my boyfriend and I were driving in the country back roads of central Illinois. It was about 9 p.m., cold and rainy, mid-October. Large wooded areas all around. We were in mid-conversation when we both cut off at the same time, and we were overcome with dread. To the right of the road was a 6/7 foot tall pale humanoid. Its arms were disproportionately long and thin. It didn't have any discernible facial features. It peered out from behind the trees and looked directly at us. We were both silent for about 30 seconds, and I finally said, did you see? And my boyfriend says, thank God you said something. I thought I was crazy. A few days later, our two friends were hanging out in their car at one of the local park areas, surrounded by woods and corn fields. The fields were recently harvested, so you could see all the way to the tree line. They said they saw something pale and incredibly thin and humanoid across the field. It ran kind of like a dog, and it disappeared into the woods within seconds. At first I thought it might be something different because I was thinking what I saw was more humanoid. Then I discovered that thousands of people have reported seeing humanoid pale, naked, lanky things that move like dogs. There's apparently particularly a lot of sightings in Illinois, so that part adds up as well. Lots of reports from the 50s and 60s of pale humanoids as well. Really makes me wonder. Anyway, I am now convinced there's an undiscovered humanoid living in America. We haven't proved they exist because they are so fast and silent. They also hide in abandoned buildings, caves, and mines. My possible encounter in Michigan. This was almost a decade ago, and I can only remember so much of it given how short of an encounter it was. I was 6 at the time and living at my grandparents'. It was late into the night, far past my bedtime, and I couldn't get any rest, so I woke up and made my way to the kitchen to get a cup of water. I had made it into the living room, and being a little kid, I was nervous about the dark room already but got close to the glass doors out to the porch to turn on the lights. The light out on the porch always was on at night to deter intruders, like we had an active camera system, but the light was completely blocked out. I figured this out and decided to turn and face what was causing the problem. A disgusting and massive coyote was staring right back at me and seemed to be trying to bite me through the glass. It looked rotted away and seemed to have mange. I was frozen in fear, and after what felt like an eternity of staring at this undead beast, it finally gave up and ran off into the cornfield behind my grandparents' house. After that, I finally gathered myself and screamed. I never have had a similar experience since other than strange encounters in my apartment complex, which is somewhat surrounded by forest on the back end, which can lead to strange things and even stranger people. I live in central Kentucky, and a couple years ago, I was working a temporary job with UPS. During the Christmas season, they hire temporary workers as driver assistants who ride along next to them and help run packages to doors. This was during December. We were driving around delivering to a rich neighborhood in rural Jessamine County, Kentucky. It was a rich gated subdivision out in the country, which is quite common here. We sometimes spent hours in these places. So we were in one of these communities around 7 p.m., and it was already dark. We pull around this cul-de-sac, and the headlights are on. By the side of this house, the headlights illuminate an animal I had never seen before. It was the size of a medium dog, with shortish gray fur and a medium-length tail. It was slinking along the side of the house to the dark backyard when we saw it. It clearly did not intend to be seen. I was like, "Did you see that?" And the driver said it was the biggest possum he had ever seen in his life. This thing was the size of a medium dog. I can only describe it as looking like a giant ferret or whale. I saw its head, and it had the same snout type. We only saw it illuminated for 2 or 3 seconds, and it retreated into the darkness. Before anyone says it was a marten or a fisher, those do not occur in Kentucky, and they have not for hundreds of years, not even anywhere close. Those are Canadian and Northeast species, and I'm lifelong familiar with coyotes. It was not a coyote. And it was bigger than those. Some background. The subdivision bordered a vast farmland area and was also very close to the river bottoms. My ex-husband was stationed in San Diego, and I flew out there to visit him. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to stay with him on the base for whatever reason. Don't ask me, because I don't even know myself. Also, I should add that I had just given birth about 3 months before this, and I had my son with me. Anyway, I found a hotel that wasn't far from the base and close to food and whatnot. I went out to get some food and then walked back to the hotel since it wasn't far. Unfortunately, with my horrible sense of direction, I got lost and ended up near a wooded area, but there was a highway also nearby. It was getting close to sunset, and I started seeing sets of shining eyes, and I thought they were just coyotes. I'm not afraid of much. After about 20 minutes, one set of shining eyes got closer, and I saw it was a coyote. I watched Steve Irwin as a teenager and remembered that if you make yourself appear bigger and louder than you actually are, they will usually run off. So I started clapping my hands and screaming. This one, however, didn't. It stood up. And started walking like a person. I've never run away from something so fast. It never followed me, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. It wasn't until I met my current husband that I found out what it was, and the look on his face when I told him this story. He went pale. He never said anything, he just kind of nodded like he understood. Maybe it knew I was still semi-healing from having recently given birth, or it saw my son in the stroller I was pushing and just wanted to scare me. Either way, I don't know. I just know it succeeded in scaring me. This isn't really a question, it's more or less me telling the story of how I saw a skinwalker and didn't even know what it was at the time. I am a female, and this incident occurred 2 years ago when I was 18. This takes place in Maine. Every summer my family and I go up to camp in Dedham/Ellsworth, Maine. It's about a 3-hour drive from my house. The camp itself is about an hour from the nearest town. I've been going to this camp my entire life, my family owns it, and have never had an incident like this happen before. I was watching TV in the middle of the night, both of my brothers and my parents had gone to bed. I heard a noise coming from the kitchen and realized that the dogs needed to go outside to do their business. So, I took my brother's 2 pit bulls and my Affenpinscher, tiny dog, outside after turning on the porch light. I walked around to the front yard, and I let the dogs off leash. It's so incredibly dark in the woods in Maine that the porch light really only illuminated the porch and nothing else, so I tried to keep an eye on them. I was momentarily distracted when I saw a loon, wild bird, on the lake. When I looked back, I saw that the pit bulls were both looking at something in the woods. I couldn't see what it was, but I assumed they'd seen a squirrel or a raccoon. It was then that I realized I didn't see Alfie anywhere. She's an awfully small dog, and she's completely black. I called for her a few times and heard some soft whimpers right where the dogs had been looking earlier. I took a couple steps in that direction and called for her again, worried that she may have gotten her paw stuck between the rocks or gotten stuck in a snake hole. Suddenly, I felt something moving behind me. I whipped around and looked down, and it was Alfie. She'd been staying close to me the whole time, I just hadn't seen her. So naturally, I was thinking, if Alfie is here, what is in the woods? I took another step forward, and the pit bulls began to growl. They were slowly advancing and were now on either side of me, looking right into the blackness of the woods. I quickly picked up Alfie and began to back up, very slowly. I'm not sure what I thought was there, but there are lots of animals in Maine, and I figured the dogs knew better than I did since I couldn't see anything. Right as I turned around, I heard the most absolutely bone-chilling thing I've ever heard in my life. Coming from the direction of the woods, I heard someone call Alfie's name. It sounded almost as if it was trying to mimic me, but it was just all wrong. The voice sounded really distorted, and it almost seemed to wail. I freaked the duck out and ran inside with the dogs. I have no idea what was out there in the woods. My camp is essentially a log cabin overlooking a lake, and our nearest neighbor, who is also family, lives at least a half mile in the opposite direction of where the thing was. What do you guys think? My cryptid story, a red-eyed creature in Indiana. Hello. This occurred about 10 years ago, and I've wondered about it ever since. It was the spring of my sophomore year of high school. I usually walk to my friend's house 2 houses down to get on the bus there. My bus showed up at about 5:50 a.m. I had just arrived at my friend's house when I realized I forgot my binder. Me and him decided to walk back to my house together. It was probably about 5:40 a.m. at this time. As we were walking to the door, a creature suddenly walked out from the side of the house in front of our Ford F-150 truck, 1996 model, I believe, though it was my dad's truck. My friend and I stopped dead in our tracks. We were coming from the other side of the house, and to get to the door of my house would require walking 10 feet closer to this creature. Now for some details on what I saw. It was about 6 or 7 feet tall. It looked like it had gray skin and a larger oval head. The main thing I remember were its eyes. They were glowing red. I didn't see any pupils or anything, just 2 glowing red circles. If I had to guess, about 1.5 inches in diameter, though I was pretty terrified at the time, I could be off. It was humanoid in shape, it just seemed fairly thin. It stopped when it saw us and just stood there as unmoving as we were. I couldn't get my legs to move. I couldn't do anything, I felt paralyzed. We probably stood that way for 3 or 4 seconds. It then lifted its right arm and placed a hand. I couldn't make out much detail on them, so I can't say if they were a proper hand shape, on the truck. It pressed down, and the truck visually shifted like a great weight was on the front end. Then the alarm on the truck went off. I have never seen its alarm go off before. I have jumped and put all my weight on the front end of the truck, and the alarm hasn't gone off. Again, we stood still for a couple seconds before I heard the front door of my house begin to open. Suddenly it ran off back behind the house, where it first came from. The alarm on the truck went off, and the door to my house shut again. I later confirmed it was my mom opening the door and turning the alarm on the truck. She had thought my friend and I were roughhousing and knocked into it. I looked back at my friend, and we both hightailed it to his house. I went to school without my binder that day. I didn't care how much trouble I was in for having no homework. I have never seen it again. For a while afterward, I did see some fairly large tracks around the house, but I don't know them well enough to claim they were unnatural. It happened in Waverly, Indiana, not too far off Highway 37. El Dorado National Forest, California. These are 2 separate encounters my brother had during our childhood. The first one was in 2009, and the second was in 2015. The location is a place called Salt Springs Reservoir in Amador County, California. The first encounter happened on the road from the campsites up to the reservoir. We were driving slowly, probably 15 miles per hour, and my brother said he saw an orangutan sitting in a bush staring at the car as we passed. He said its skin was gray and it had red hair like an orangutan. We speculated it could have escaped from a zoo, but ultimately played it off to being his imagination. My brother was 11 at the time, I was 9. I somewhat remember us talking about it when it happened. The next encounter happened in 2015 at the Salt Springs Reservoir campsites. Specifically the campsite south of the North Fork McCullumney River, which is the outlet of the reservoir. So we spent 2 days camping. The first was a normal day. We hiked behind the reservoir and swam in our favorite watering hole. The next day we drove up a service road a couple miles and shot rifles. When we got to camp that afternoon, we had to get more wood for the fire. My brother had brought his buddy along, who was honestly built like a starving Bigfoot, and decided to chop down a 7-foot sapling for firewood. We watched because it was funny. It started to get dark, and I remember sparks flying off the tree when his hatchet hit it. That night those 2 slept in a separate tent in the next campsite over because my dad told them to move because they were being too noisy the first night. They had no fire in their campsite, so it was pitch black. I couldn't see their tent and could only faintly hear them. That next morning, my brother said they heard something taking very heavy steps outside their tent in the middle of the night. Since I've gotten into Bigfoot, I've asked him about it. He said he woke up and it was very dark in the tent, but he heard what he described as footsteps that sounded like someone dropping bags of cement on the dirt. He said he looked over to wake his buddy up, but he was already sitting up, and he could see the white of his eyes in the dark because he was just staring in shock listening to these footsteps outside their tent. Then he said they faded away, and he fell back asleep. We used to think it was a bear, but now we're beginning to believe it was a squatch that was probably investigating these dumb teenage littlefoots that cut down a perfectly fine tree for no reason. My first encounter. My grandparents have property in rural Pennsylvania. It has a forest with a clearing in the middle. The edges of the field are mowed so you can walk around it. The middle of the field has 2-foot-high grass filled with poison ivy. The land has sinkholes opening up everywhere. If you drop a rock in one of the holes, you will never hear it hit the bottom. The sinkholes are connected to nearby cave systems. Me and some friends were walking around the field at about 10:30 at night. I was in the back. I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A pale white figure ducked down in the grass. It looked about 8 feet tall. It was not human. There are no animals in the area that fit what I saw, so I thought I was imagining things. Eventually we circled back around. In the spot where I thought I saw the thing, the grass was matted down, like something was hiding there. There were no footprints leading away, like the thing had really long legs. I think the thing was a crawler. I am currently trying to hunt for proof of the existence of crawlers. Possible Bigfoot experience in Michigan. Never really was big in the Bigfoot scene until last month out in the middle of the woods in Waterloo, Pinckney for a small game/backpacking trip with my buddy. Got there last night around 11:30 p.m. We set up our camp by about 12:30. Around 2 a.m. we wake up, and my buddy mentions to me about how cold it was. We hear footsteps around 20 to 25 feet away from us. We both are just laying still at this point, just to hear what's with us. The most loud, freakiest, inhuman yell/scream/roar is shouted towards us twice before it takes off fast from us with heavy 2-footed running. The only remotely close animals I've heard make this sound are mountain lions and cougars. The way it was running sounded 2-footed, as opposed to a 4-legged gallop, and the sound of it crashing through the woods made us realize it was big. We joked about it being a Bigfoot. Then we saw how much he's seen in these parts of Michigan. We think they must have seen us in the dark. After this, we settled into the car for the night. Background: both my friend and I are Marine Reserves and have been raised to be very avid outdoorsmen. My father and I are into bushcrafting and backpacking, my mom is into car camping, and my friend's parents are avid hunters and backpackers, and his mom was DNR. We're no strangers to the woods and wildlife and have experienced a lot of nature and different animals and sounds that are part of our natural habitat in Michigan. This is unlike anything either of us have heard. Quartzville Creek encounter. So after listening to several discussions on here, I feel that I should add my encounter. This happened about 8 years ago in the Quartzville Creek area of Oregon. I am hesitant about sharing the exact location here. I respect all life, and I don't want a bunch of people to go up there and try to hunt it down or anything along those lines. This was on a Wednesday, early July. I had gone up there to go fishing. The Department of Fish and Wildlife posts it when they stock different fishing areas. And the river was stocked the day before upstream. I would go up there the day after and can usually max out on trout in a short period of time. I was fishing, and there was no one around and hardly any traffic on the road. I only saw a couple cars up there on the road. While I was fishing, I heard some rustling in the trees but didn't think anything about it. I caught a fish and pulled it in and put it in my bucket to take home. While I was fishing a little bit later, I heard some more branches breaking and looked up along the side of the mountain and saw a couple treetops moving. Each time I caught a fish after that, I felt like I was being watched. I wasn't sure what was going on. I heard something for each of the next few fish I pulled in. After getting my fourth fish, I set it up and cast it out. About 5 minutes later, I got my last fish for the day because I maxed out on the daily limit. I got all my stuff together and put all my gear inside my truck and went to go use the porta potty nearby. After I got out, I started walking towards my truck, and I heard a noise coming from my left on a logging road. As I looked up, I saw what I can only describe as a large, hairy man walking across the road and down the other side. When I saw him, he was about halfway across the road, and in a couple steps he was in the trees and out of sight. If I had to guess, I would have to say about 7 to 8 feet tall. I didn't want to run and make a bunch of noise and attract its attention and just walked back to my truck and got in. As soon as I started it, I just hit the gas and got out of there. My truck had a loud exhaust at the time, and I was afraid it would come over there when it heard my truck. As I got to the road and pulled out, I looked back and thought I saw it near where the porta potty was because you could see the area from the road. All of this took place in about 45 minutes. This is the second time I have seen what I think was a Bigfoot. The first encounter I might share at a later time. Unidentified creature, curious. I'm living in a small town in Arizona, and my siblings and I keep having this encounter with this creature, shadow, I'm not sure. It's about 7 feet tall. It has a hunch to it and a tail, but we can't ever really see the end of it, if that makes sense. It comes across our backyard or when we are out near the river or out in the open wild past sundown. It only really approaches when our backs are turned, and none of us really see any features as for a face or anything definite, so that's why I include shadow as a reference. It's tapped on our windows and has shoved my sister and me on a few encounters where it was more aggressive than normal. Other than that, it normally just stands in the corners of the yard or hunches under the windows. My sister describes it as it's about a 6 to 7 foot tall man with a tail that doesn't seem to end. I can't really ever see anything else besides that. So if anyone has any idea of what to do, it's been bothering our animals and causing us to wake up anywhere between 8 p.m. and 4 a.m., and all of our cameras don't catch anything. I'd just like a night's rest. Half man, half dog encounter? It was the end of my shift, and I decided to take the trash out with me since I parked right beside the dumpster. As I was walking towards the dumpster, I heard what sounded like a dog whining, so I looked around me. I didn't see anything, so as I walked to my car, I kept looking around to see if I could find the hurt pup. I unlock my car and do another quick scan of my surroundings when a car that was turning onto the street illuminated the yard across the street from where I was. It was a quick glance but long enough to freak me out. I saw crouching near a fence a giant, half man, half dog creature. I just stared. Even after the car passed by, I could feel it watching me, and I just stared in the area where I saw it. My mind wasn't processing what I saw, and my danger senses were not going off. I was stuck in shock. Then something snapped me out of whatever trance I was in, and I jumped into my car and locked the doors. I sat there trying to tell myself that I saw what I saw, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it wasn't a humanoid dog and definitely wasn't a werewolf. I finally started my car and left. I had a long drive home down a very empty and dark highway, and I felt like I was being followed the entire way home. I got to my ex-boyfriend's house, where I was staying at the time, and I ran inside because, as silly as this sounds, I felt like I was being watched. A few days went by, and I forgot about my encounter until I was closing again and decided not to take the trash out. That was a job the morning crew could handle. But as I locked the store and walked to my car, there on the hood were flowers picked from the ground, little Indian paintbrushes and some other wild flowers. I was a little worried because I was afraid my ex was playing with me. We were broken up, but I still lived with his mom while he lived with some friends. He was a loser with no car, so he couldn't have put them there, but I also never thought he would beat me and cheat on me, and he did that too, so I couldn't be too sure. I took the flowers and got into my car and took my usual route home. The music was blaring, and as I was getting closer to the only street light that illuminated a crossroad, I saw this towering figure standing in the middle of the road. I stopped just short of the circle of lights on the road. I was sitting in the dark, but in front of me under the light, it was huge. I could see its snout and the claws, and its extremely muscled legs were hairy, and it walked towards my car. I was scared. It reached out and put its long, over-exaggerated paw on the hood of my car and pressed down, causing the front end to buckle. I thought, this is it. This is how I die on an old, empty road late at night. Luckily, an 18-wheeler came over the hill, and it ran off. Again, I got home and ran inside. A few weeks passed, and I put the encounter in the furthest part of my head. I didn't want to think about it. My mind couldn't process if it was real or a dream, so I just didn't think about it. Fast forward to a month later. I had started talking to someone I met online, and we were meeting for the first time. I remembered that in the clothes I threw on my bed from the dryer there was a skirt, and I had bought the perfect shirt to wear with it, but when I got home, the skirt wasn't on my bed. I thought maybe my ex's mom hid it, but she said she had no idea what I was talking about, so I picked a different outfit. The date went okay, but I didn't really talk to the guy after the date. He ghosted me. I was kind of sad but not surprised. That's usually what happens to me anyway, so I didn't dwell on it too much. A few more weeks went by, and one morning I heard her dog barking and freaking out. She usually puts him outside before she goes to work, and I let him in when I get up. He was going crazy, so I went to check on him. He had wrapped his lead around a pole, so I went to untangle him. Nothing was in the yard, no animals, nothing, so I went back inside to use the bathroom. When I went back out to let him in, there was my skirt I lost a month before sitting in the grass damp from the morning dew, smelled horrible and had tiny holes all throughout it. It wasn't there when I went outside before, but it is there now. I couldn't believe it. I sent pictures to my ex's mom and told her I found my skirt. I'd how it ended up outside with holes in it. It wasn't dirty, so there was no way the dog buried it, but it did have a funky smell. I moved out shortly after because living there I found out why my ex was so toxic. I sometimes feel like I'm still being watched, but I'm not scared by it anymore. I look at it as a guardian and protector. I don't know if it's all related, but I like to think it is. Goatman? I was hiking in the woods with my boyfriend, and we came to this really cool lake high up in the hills. I was going to go for a swim after a scran, and my boyfriend didn't fancy it, so I went to scout the next leg of the walk. When I go to the water's edge, I see a dead sheep at the bottom, and there is this horrible metallic smell like rust or blood coming from the bushes at the edge. It is so bad, like the waters are stagnant, though it looked really clear, and I get dressed again and set off to find my boyfriend. Even though I didn't get my feet or clothes wet, the horrible smell is following me, sometimes just a bit and sometimes really strong enough to make me feel like gagging, like thick in my throat. I climb up on the ridge to scout where my boyfriend is up to, see if I can catch up, and save him walking back. I can see some of the path back, but there is no one on it ATM. If we are separated, you always stay still, so I wait for him as planned, but the smell is so strong, and I start to get really antsy and uncomfortable. After like 20 minutes, I give up and walk down, thinking he'll have to use that path to get back to me. I shouted for him every now and again, like hello mostly, but I definitely said, Anon, BF, where are you? In a sing-songy voice, and the other thing I remember saying was, I didn't want to swim with a dead sheep. I was just shouting to myself mostly. About 10 minutes down, it comes back to thick woods, and the path gets really thin, and I swear I saw him just up ahead. I shouted again and walked a bit faster, something made the hair on my neck start to go up, and I wanted to make sure I caught up with him ASAP. This is the part that really freaked me out. I heard someone in the woods, really far away, shouting hello, but in the exact same tone as I did earlier. I think shit, someone out there is following me now. I'm only 120 pounds and really short, so I'm really worrying who the duck is. I don't want to run because if you hurt your ankle out there, there's not much chance, so I just carefully walk as fast as possible down the track. After about another 5 minutes, I heard, where are you? Like, all singing and drawn out exactly like I said on the high trail, and this time it was one in the wind, like quite far away. When I reached the bottom of the hills where the first trail splits off, I was feeling so worried that I hadn't caught up with my boyfriend but also really freaked out and wanting to get back to the car. I thought I'd wait at the bench for about 2 minutes in case we missed each other somehow. I didn't want to shout and draw attention, but I gave my boyfriend one more chance. I screamed his name, and if not, I'd just go and see if he was at the car, and this is the part that's really bad. I heard something come like really fast running down the hill through the trees, almost rolling. It was so fast, breaking loads of branches, and suddenly my boyfriend comes out of the bushes panting. He was like, "What are you doing down here?" Apparently he was hiking back up the trail when he heard me shouting from in the woods, saying hello and where are you? He walked away from the trail to find me and kept hearing snapping branches and thought he saw movement in the trees ahead. He said he started to get freaked out when I was moving further away and taking him over the crest of the next hill along and said I kept saying the same things over and over again. He said he shouted something like "come the duck" towards me and I replied with I didn't want to swim with a dead sheep and he knew there was something wrong because it was nonsensical and in a weird voice like practicing and drawing out the wrong syllables. It was about then he heard me scream from the bottom of the hill, and he said in that moment he just knew something was ducked, and he ran down the hill. We both took the trail down as fast as possible and were back to the car by dark and drove home so fast. My boyfriend to this day won't talk about it, but I think someone was trying to lure him into the woods. My best friend told me a story about Goatman and said I should ask on here, but I'm in the UK, and we've never even heard of them here. What do you think? Giant blackbird/owl/creature? I saw when I was little in the 70s. Just thought I'd share something that happened to me when I was little. I just can't get out of my mind what I witnessed one day sometime in the 1970s when I was 5 or 6 years old, and it bugs me to this day. I was at my grandparents' house playing in the front yard one summer afternoon. The front yard ran adjacent to the road, and there was a big maple tree on the left side of the yard. It was huge and very old, and the lower branches were large and thick like the trunk of a tree. On the right side of the yard bordering the neighbor's driveway was a very old pine tree, a Scotch pine with huge twisting branches. I was playing alone that day and pretending that the old pine tree was a witch's house, so I ran over and knocked on the witch's door. While standing near the pine tree, I heard a sound that caused me to look up across the yard at the maple tree. I noticed one of the big lower branches moving up and down and saw a giant black bird sitting on the branch staring at me, and I froze because I had never seen anything like it before. I didn't know what type of bird it was, but it had a big round head that sat low on its shoulders. It looked like a giant black owl to me, and there was white in the center of its face, which I perceived to be a big eye. Whether it was actually a big eye or not, I don't know, but the bird thing was very, very dark, and that still stands out to me, how black it was. If I had to guess now, I'd say its body was around 3 to 4 feet tall. I couldn't stop staring at it, and it was probably just a few seconds that I had been looking at it when a normal bird flew by, and this thing jumped off the branch very quickly and grabbed the normal bird in midair, and they both struggled and fought, and I heard a lot of screeching. That's when I started screaming because I was suddenly afraid. My mom eventually came running out of the house to see what was wrong because for me to scream like that was totally out of character. She never saw the thing because it had flown away. The adults didn't really seem to take me seriously, and growing up, I would sometimes wonder what it was I saw that day. In my child's mind, I believed I had seen a giant black owl with a big white eye. This experience is what made me take an interest in cryptids. Over the years I've researched and read about different bird species, but nothing ever fits all the facts. I'm not one to jump to conclusions that it was some sort of monster, but I do have an open mind, and I started to wonder if I had seen something supernatural. I started reading about known giant birds, thunderbirds, the owlman, and lechusa. The fact that I saw it attack another bird lends credence that it may just be a giant predatory bird of some type, maybe one that was out of its natural territory? I don't know. Just thought I'd see if anyone had any ideas of what it could have been. Thanks for listening. Charlie Victor's Sasquatch encounter circa 1900. There are now only a few of the wild giants of the mountains, said Charlie in his terse Indian dialect. They are rarely seen and seldom met, but some still live in the mountains around here. I have met them on several occasions. Some of the times I saw them, nothing happened. We stood and looked at one another, but the last time was not a happy meeting. It happened this way: I was hunting in the mountains and had my dog with me. One day I came out on a plateau where there were several big cedar trees. The dog rushed up to one of the trees and began to growl and bark. Looking up to see what had excited him, I noticed a large hole in the trunk about 7 feet from the ground. The dog kept jumping at the tree and scratching, looking around to me to lift him up. When I did so, he dropped down inside the hole. Then there was an awful noise. I heard the dog growling and barking and something screaming. I thought my dog must be fighting a bear and holding my rifle ready and called to him to drive the animal out. A moment later, something shot out of that hole. I fired, and the creature fell to the ground. I looked at it, then I felt sick, for what I had shot looked like a naked white boy about 12 years old. He was bleeding from a bullet wound in his leg, but when I stepped forward, he twisted away and let out a wild scream. From deep in the trees came a reply. Nearer and nearer came the voice, and every now and again the wounded boy would cry out as if calling directions. Then out of the forest came a Sasquatch woman. She was about 7 feet tall, big built all over, and her skin was as dark as mine. Her long straight hair fell to her knees. She looked so big and strong that I am sure if she had laid hands on me, she could have broken every bone in my body. When I saw her, I felt scared, and instinctively I lifted my rifle in case I had to defend myself. The wild woman ran toward the boy, bent over him, and then turned on me savagely, her eyes like balls of fire. In the Douglas dialect, she growled, "You have hurt my friend." I explained in the same language, I am part Douglas myself, that I had mistaken the boy for a bear and was very sorry for the accident. Anyway, I pointed out he was not badly hurt. She made no reply, but, picking up the boy as easily as if he weighed nothing, lifted him to her shoulder and strode out into the woods. I do not think the boy belonged to the Sasquatch people because he was white-skinned and she called him her friend. No, she must have stolen him as a child or run across him in some other way. My dad had an unexplainable encounter today. Does anyone know what this could be? My dad had a weird encounter/experience today that neither he nor I can explain, so I'm hoping the good people of this here may be able to shine a light on what the hell happened, as it's really creeped us all out. For a little background, my dad has had some paranormal encounters throughout his life, and, while he is a little skeptical about the existence of such things as demons or cryptids, he largely believes that there is certainly another plane of existence somewhere and that death isn't the final act. He isn't superstitious by any means, but will not have anything like Ouija boards in the house, etc. I wouldn't say he believes in things such as heaven per se, but perhaps reincarnation? Regardless, he knows that what he saw today was not of this world, and it gave him a feeling of pure, unadulterated dread and evil. Earlier today my dad was on his way to work via train, and where we live, UK, some stations have 2 platforms where trains go in opposite directions from one another and run on opposite routes, so he had to cross a bridge to get to the right platform. As he stood waiting for his train, he overheard a woman talking loudly and in quite confusing sentences. He turned in her direction, and she was staring at him, or perhaps through him, and was pointing in his direction. It was then he knew something was wrong. She looked like a normal, older woman except for her eyes. My dad said, and this is verbatim, I couldn't see the white of her eyes, op. Her eyes were pure black, maybe deep dark blue, but she had no pupils and no whites. He told me, op, you might think I'm kidding you, he does like to wind us up, but I swear to you, the feeling I got when I looked at this woman was pure evil. He tried to turn his attention anywhere but her, but his gaze kept being drawn to her. Her eyes never changed, and this was outside in broad daylight, so there certainly weren't any shadows or light tricks. At one point he saw her drink from a paper coffee cup, the type of takeaway cup you get from a cafe, and the way she drank from it stuck out to him. As she drank from the cup, still staring in his direction by the way, she squeezed the cup between her flat palms until it was only a small slit and drank from it without breaking her stare. When his train arrived, he got on quickly, thankful to get away from her attention, but she got on the same train in the next carriage over. He hopped off and got on the furthest carriage from her. He wasn't alone on the platform. There was a couple with a pram standing behind her who moved away slightly after hearing her talk and were quite freaked out by her too, though she never turned to them, they only saw her from the back. This happened this afternoon, and he told me about this encounter not 15 minutes ago. This has understandably left us creeped out and very confused. Can anyone explain this? Any questions or answers are appreciated. My experience in Northern California, October 7, 2020. During the fall of 2020, I was trimming weed and staying with friends in Willow Creek, California. I currently live in my home state in the Midwest but lived in Humboldt County for 7 years during my 20s. So when the pandemic started, I lost my job as a massage therapist. Being that it was an awkward time to do my job anyway, I figured why not see my friends and make some money while in limbo? By the time my encounter happened, it was October, and I had been working out west since July. The fall in that area is typically busy with travelers, so I thought it would be cool to meet a guy on a dating site while visiting to help pass the time. Right away I hit it off with a fellow farm worker who happened to be just down the road. We went out for dinner and decided to continue the night by laying under the stars at a local campground in Willow Creek on the Trinity River. The campsites were further down the road, but we decided to pull off on the beach by the water. From traveling, my car was full of camping gear. We took my sleeping bag with blankets down a path to the water not far from my vehicle. For the record, we did have a 12-pack of Steelhead Ale, my favorite local beer, but each of us had only had 2 beers. One at the restaurant and one on the river bank. It wasn't long after laying there that it started to rain, so we ended up getting a little hot and heavy in my car. The rain lasted about an hour. To my knowledge it was the first rain of the season, and during that time we stayed inside until it stopped. Eventually we made it back out but decided to just sleep there and continue hanging out. I have a RAV4, so we put the back seats down and made a bed. While doing so, I took out my camping tote, which had some really valuable gear inside as well as his backpack and guitar. This is a key part of the story because it just doesn't make sense that if it was a hoax, then why didn't they steal our stuff? At this point, it was around 11:45 p.m. The bed was made, so we sat in the back of the car with the hatch open, which was facing the river, to smoke a joint. I was naked, wrapped in a blanket, and he in his boxers snuggled up to me. A few minutes into conversation, we started hearing a low guttural growl coming from the rocky beach down towards the water. Take in mind it was super foggy out and there were no street lights around. So we never actually saw them, but oh, did we hear them? The sound went on for about 30 seconds or so. It almost sounded like a didgeridoo at first, but you could tell it was a voice. Kind of like a growl/gargling sound. This was also really weird. We both immediately became emotional and struck with fear. Tears started streaming down my cheeks as we grabbed each other, and I said, "That's not human." It was like my nervous system instantly knew something was off. He then yelled really loud, "Hey, what are you doing down there?" This is when it gets absolutely terrifying, and I mean seriously, the most afraid I have ever been in my life. I still to this day have PTSD from this experience. It's gotten easier to tell this story, but it continues to haunt me. I dream about it and think about it constantly. The sound abruptly stopped when he did that, but only for a second, and then proceeded to scream the most ungodly, otherworldly sound I never in a million years would imagine to hear. We instinctively shut the back door and laid down, shaking. At this point, it was pure terror and somewhat surreal. It was almost as if time stood still, but it all happened pretty fast. As we lay there trembling and not knowing what to do next, the sounds began to get louder and more intense. It started to sound like multiple high and low-pitched voices that were howling and yelling, and at some points it sounded like they were laughing. Almost like a gorilla/hyena hybrid. That sound will forever be burned into my mind. We both became hysterical. He also started to cry and kept asking me, "What do we do?" I told him to lay still and be quiet. I couldn't believe this was happening. Then they surrounded my car. It literally sounded like they were all around us. It truly felt like they were taunting us, but in the most horrible way, and trust me, it worked. The cackling and howling with talking, BTW, they seriously have a language. We could hear them bantering back and forth. It was like nothing I've ever heard, until someone played for me the Sierra sounds. It's absolutely unnerving how similar that recording is to what we experienced. Also, at some point during this, they began making really loud thud noises, but we're not sure how. This went on for what seemed like forever, but in reality it was only 5 minutes or so until one of them was so close to my back passenger window that we both screamed uncontrollably and the guy told me to drive. I frantically found my keys in the mess of blankets and jumped in the driver's seat. I just remember shaking so bad I could barely push my foot on the pedal. The lights turned on but we never saw a thing. All I could do was put my car in drive and get TF out of there. Looking back on it, I really wish one of us would have had our phones out to record, but it all happened so fast, that honestly was the last thing on mind. We ended up parked outside of my friend's house and laid there in shock until the sun came up. We went over the whole thing numerous times. Did they want to hurt us? If so, why didn't they? Was it a prank? At times it felt like trickery, but the sound was so out of this world that if it was, they must have had some kind of equipment. Plus, these beings had a presence, a powerful one at that. He even thought we should call the police and report it. We were that scared. Once morning with no sleep and completely hung over from the adrenaline, we drove back to get our things. Truly thinking everything would be gone, to our surprise, nothing had been touched. Not the beer, nor the cooler with some food, or our valuables. We walked around and looked for tracks but didn't see a thing. I still don't know what to think of it and didn't begin the Bigfoot rabbit hole until after that night. As cliche as it is, that area is highly known for encounters, so we just assumed if it wasn't people or an animal, then it must be real after all. Him and I don't really talk, but we occasionally text to remind each other that we survived some truly crazy stuff together. Maybe someday I'll get him to go on a podcast with me or something. I'm just glad to have had a witness because it truly is unbelievable until it happens to you. And I'm grateful for my vehicle because I'm not sure if I'd be here to tell the tale if we would have been in my tent. I don't really know if they would have hurt us, nor do I ever want to chance that again. Let's just say the woods will never be the same. Stories from the North. Hello, I just want to start off by saying that I am by no means proficient at words or writing things down. I'm quite an oldish man now that I'm 47, and for many, many years I have done my service to my people. The Wet'suwet'en of northern British Columbia for decades. I have kept an eye out for these things that you call a skinwalker and learned as much as I could about them, though we have no word for them. In that way, I get it in this day and age. And age it may be silly to think that there are real, but for many, many generations to my people, it has been a very real threat, although mostly unknown, because it's better the youth don't know we know how children can get, but there are a few of us who know, including my nephew, who is the one who pointed me towards this place. He encouraged me to come here and share my experiences that I've gathered over the years, and I'll start off by the first time I ever found out about these things. I was still a young man many years ago when I was with my father trapping on Lake Babine. It was during the winter, so most of the lake was frozen over, and due to some setbacks, we were walking back from the trap line in the dark across the ice, and we had been using this path on the ice for days by this time. I do not know how long we were walking for before my father stopped in front of me. Turned to me and told me to, no matter what, keep walking forward. Do not acknowledge it, do not move if it moves. Just keep walking. I do not know what he meant at first, but when we kept walking, I noticed what looked like a snow bank on the ice. I was confused at first while looking at it. But as we got closer, I realized that it looked like a person. Sitting hunched over cross-legged, I became more and more confused and then fearful as we got closer, and it got larger and larger by the time we were about to pass it. It was massive, it was sitting down, but it was nearly as tall as me standing. And as we passed it, I saw out the corner of my eye. I think it reached for us or raised its hand. Whatever happened, I wanted to run in terror and fear, but I remember what my father said and the urgency in his voice when he told me to do so. I grated my teeth and bit my tongue and kept walking, and from then on, it didn't grab us, it didn't get up and run. It sat in place, sitting there as we walked by in silence and in the dark. I asked my father almost every day about those things. He would get angry until he told me what he knew about them, and he told me the dangers and how they're more of a legend now, but acknowledging them can still be dangerous. Since then I've been looking, searching for them, seeking signs and clues, and they are very uncommon in and around towns or cities, but they occasionally come when food is scarce, and the few signs they leave can be mistaken for a mountain lion. I've also only seen them once from a good distance, but the sight alone is a terrifying thing to experience, especially when you know it's seeing you too. 2017 encounter in NW, Connecticut. It was about 11 p.m. on a warmer summer night, and I was driving home from a friend's house on a fairly rural backroad here in CT. From a distance, I could see a cop car with its lights on, pulled up in the middle of my lane, parked side by side to a pickup truck. My first instinct was that maybe the truck had hit something or been pulled over, but it was weird because the cop wasn't pulled up behind the truck like they do, it was parked parallel to it. I had my windows down because it was nice out and I could hear the cop and the man in the car shouting in conversation through their windows. I listened to the two talk from their windows and overheard the man in the truck say something like, "Man, something isn't right. It's not hit or injured. I just found it like that." This grown man had genuine fear in his voice and was just pointing frantically out his window, going on and on about how they should just shoot it. I turn my attention in the direction of where the guy and cop are pointing, and my headlights illuminate this sight of a deer that is sitting directly beside the cop's car. It was extremely weird because the deer was sitting in perfect alignment with the yellow lines on the road as if it had been intentionally trying to place itself on the line and in the direct middle of the two lanes. This thing looked like a prop or statue the way it has assembled itself. I could see a liquid pooled around the deer that I assumed was blood until I realized that the deer was seemingly uninjured and showed no visible signs of wounds or blood. While scanning the scene from my car behind the cop, I realized that the liquid that was pooled around it wasn't blood but was actually saliva that was falling from the animal's mouth like a waterfall and collecting all over the road and down its neck. Its head was weirdly shaped, skinnier than it should have been in contrast to its giant body, and it was bobbling like a bobblehead on a dashboard, staring straight in the direction of the cop and truck. It looked hypnotic or something. I thought maybe it has rabies or something. Then I kind of tuned into my body, and my stomach knotted up and my heart started racing. I can't describe the feeling here, but it sort of felt like I realized that time was moving super slowly, like in a dream or daze. I was deciding if I should just wait there behind the cars or go around the scene in the opposite lane when I noticed something else that was so off. This deer was sitting in a position that unnerved me to no end. This animal was literally sitting crisscross applesauce style with its legs and joints all contorted and pretzeled in a way that seemed physically impossible unless it had been manipulated by someone to do that. It was even more weird that it was sitting this way in the dead middle of the road and directly aligned with the yellow line. It all looked so off, and it all felt like it was being experienced and processed by me in a disconnected and time-bending way. I immediately felt this unfamiliar paralyzing fear inside my stomach and chest. I felt like I was seeing something I shouldn't or was someplace I shouldn't be. I just wanted to get out of there, so I slowly, to avoid interaction with the cop, veered into the opposite lane and creeped by the deer. My intuition was strongly telling me not to look out my passenger side window as I inched past the animal, who was now like I leveled to my car and 2 feet away. I ended up looking, and when I did, it was like this thing knew before my eyes even hit it that I was looking at it. The deer shook its head around to face me and locked eyes with me right as I looked at it. I will never ever forget its eyes and the feeling they evoked in me. They were black, like darker than shadows, and stared at me with some kind of intention or intelligence or something. I was physically paralyzed and drawn to a complete stop for what felt like minutes while this deer just stared at me with its cold eyes. I know this sounds crazy, maybe it was just the fear, but those moments I was making eye contact with it. I felt like I was in a trance and like my whole life was sort of flashing before my eyes in a dreamy and terrifying way. I felt like 10 seconds became 10 minutes and a weird vulnerability like a stranger walked in on me naked. Every hair on my body was standing up, and my heart was racing, and then it all just stopped, and I snapped out of it and drove on. I was terrified the whole way home but also so curious for an explanation. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a sick deer or that it was hit and maybe internally injured. But some details of how its legs were crossed and how it was placed, and how it knew I was going to look at it before I did, and how its eyes looked and made me feel. It all just felt weirdly paranormal or unexplainable. I immediately hit the internet when I got home and discovered those diseases that make deer act off and also, for the first time, heard about not a deer. That logical side of me wants to chalk that experience I had up to a diseased deer, but the part of me that felt and saw that I did just thinks there was something more to it. Needless to say, it was the hands down scariest experience of my life and really shook me for a while. I've felt unsettled around deer ever since then, even though before the experience I used to really enjoy seeing them. So yeah, I don't know how to explain what I saw and experienced that night. But I'll never forget it. My friends were chased by a werewolf in Oregon at Mount Pisgah. This happened around the year 2000. About a year after this took place, I started dating one of these friends, and that's when I first heard about this dog/wolf story. I have since asked each friend, over years and miles apart, and they all remember the same encounter. Before my ex was even my boyfriend, let's call him Jay, he and our other friends were about 17 or 18 years old. At that age, I remember it being an adventure to find a place to smoke. Let's hike to underscore and puff. Ah, good old days. The four of them decided to drive to Mount Pisgah, a beautiful wooded area outside of Eugene, Oregon. It's more of a hill, but it's nature in its prime for sure. I've been out there many times growing up, and I know exactly what trail they were on. It was Jay and his best friend B, and their girlfriends, S and M. They had driven in B's little white sedan, parked in the parking lot, and hiked the trail to the river, where they smoked some bowls. The group spent the day out there, swimming and puffing and swimming, just being typical Oregonian teens. I can imagine that hunger is what drove them to go home after a few hours, as the sun began to set. Either activity alone is bound to get someone hungry, let alone both. So, they walked along the well-worn main dirt path to the parking lot. This has since been paved, as I saw on Google Maps. It doesn't take but 20 minutes or so for them to get back to the little footbridge by the parking lot that they had crossed when they hiked in. When they reach this small footbridge near the parking lot, B looks out into the vast field between them and the wooded mountain and notices a huge dog. They all later described it as the biggest dog they had ever seen. The dog was just sitting there, not looking scary, just looking like a huge, friendly dog, about 70 yards away. It was starting to get dark, but from M's description and the drawing she did for me later in 2005, it was very shaggy and furry. My friends continued to walk across this small wooden bridge, and one of the girls screamed. The big dog was now on its hind legs, standing much closer than when they had seen it just a couple of seconds earlier. It had traversed most of the large field in the seconds it took them to get across this 10-foot-long bridge. Whatever this thing was, it was fast, quiet and stealthy. My four friends ran to the car, and they had the classic, cliché "I can't get the key in," because B was fumbling madly for the keys. At this point, the dog was standing at the very edge of the parking lot, looking at them. As my ex Jay had said, every time they looked up, he was closer but not moving. All of them recounted how surreal it was to see a dog standing on its hind legs. I don't know if it ran for a few ticks and then stood up again at intervals in the field, but that's the way they describe it. Many times I asked them, "Are you sure it wasn't a bear?" No. It definitely was a dog standing on hind legs. A big dog that was stalking them. Also, this is in Lane County, Oregon. In the year 2000, there are few if any bears out there. It would be odd, but then again, I wasn't there. The kids got into the car and sped off, leaving the Pisgah dog to his own business. I've never had a reason to doubt any of their stories. In fact, S doesn't like to talk about the incident at all because it's too creepy for her to recall. The Grayman. Not sure if this is a crawler. I moved to a rural area of the North Georgia/Alabama mountains. Sand Mountain was the name of the place. It was connected to Dade County, Georgia, but right over the state line in Higdon, Alabama. I was around 8 years old. When I first got there, it was a total culture shock having moved from a large urban area in the Southwest. I vividly remember driving through a virtual sea of green right outside of Atlanta. The novelty of the trees soon wore off, and I dove back into a book to stave off the boredom of a long drive to my new home. At some point I started to feel really uneasy, so I told my mom. She wrote it off as a symptom of the major life change or something to that effect. I did my best to just accept it as nothing more than that, but the anxiety and sense of oppression got a lot worse. It seemed that heavy feeling directly correlated to the proximity to my new home. That was a feeling that I would live with for more than a decade. I would soon find out that it was nothing in relation to what I would soon experience. I can't say how long it was until it started, but it had to be a few months after we moved into a little trailer at the end of a long driveway in the clearing of the woods. Our closest neighbor was well over a mile away. My room was on the opposite end of the trailer as my mother's and her husband's room. I had a huge bay window, which will be important in a minute. So it all started keyed odd one night I couldn't sleep despite being tired from exploring the acres of woods that I now resided in. So I'm lying there on Cartoon Network in the dark, trying to fall asleep. Very suddenly, I was deep in the woods in the southeast of the property. It was a place that I had been before, but not really much. I did recognize it. It was the strangest feeling, like being a passenger in another's mind, seeing through their eyes but having no control, just along for the ride. It was disorienting, to say the least. It exponentially worsened when whatever it was started to move. It was an unnatural speed, predatory and precise, kind of reminiscent of the way an animal would stalk its prey, darting from cover to cover, tree to tree. It was a blur until it stopped again, just giving me the time I needed to regain my bearings as much as I was able. This only lasted for a few seconds, and I sapped back to my own body again, laying in bed. It was such a strange feeling, and I didn't want to even think about it. I didn't want it to be real. The next night it happened again, and the next and the next. After a few days, I realized that each time it was for a bit longer, and it definitely seemed to allow me to see through it for longer each night. I can't say how long this lasted, but it was long enough to be a commonplace event every night. One night I was coming up to the clearing that the trailer was in. As I realized this, though my consciousness was in this thing's mind to some degree, an all-consuming sense of dread started to rise up in me, worsening with every brief pace behind cover. Not thinking back, this thing didn't seem to operate in any sense of time and space that we are accustomed to, because it would pick up every night in the place that I left its mind or whatever, but I don't think it was frozen there till the next day. I think it was playing some sort of game or something, kind of like when an orca plays with a seal or a cat with a mouse. As my terror reached a crescendo, I was suddenly ejected back to myself. I don't know if I did it or if it killed whatever link it had made, but it was different this time. I sat straight up and turned toward the window. I just knew that it was there, and that it was a few feet outside of the tree line. As much as I didn't want to, I still gathered myself up and looked out that bay window at the tree line. It was there, leaning from behind a large tree right at the edge of the woods. It was very tall, and its skin was taut like it was stretched over its bones, but I don't really remember any detail of its skeletal anatomy. All its features were grotesquely elongated, like they were stretched out purposely. It had long clawed fingers that curled around into the common sign that you would use to beckon someone closer to you. Its face was large and humanoid, but with that same stretched out look. It had a smile that was impossibly wide and large, long, sharp teeth, skinny, and needle-like. Its eyes were really big, even with that for its size. It just stood there staring at me through my window, cocked its head, and motioned for me to come to it. I call it the Gray Man, although it had no discernible gender. It was an animal terror unlike anything I have ever felt, but I found myself having to actively fight an almost uncontrollable impulse to go out to it. It was like it could almost compelling me to go with it to the forest. After what seemed like forever, I was able to pull myself away from the window and crawl back into bed. All I could do the rest of that night was wait for it to get worn out of waiting and decide to come to me. It never did, and when the sun finally came out, I couldn't feel it anymore. This was the new normal for me. Almost every night it would come back and wait and watch. The compulsion lessened eventually, which was the only real silver lining. I stopped sleeping a lot and would spend the nights in the living room as much as I could, which wasn't often. After quite some time of living with this thing appearing all the time in different places, it got closer at night. I don't have a total memory of this night exactly. I guess I should say that I don't have a complete memory. I think I gave it away in something else. After being plagued by this thing for quite a while, it was really getting to me. I wasn't sleeping, which affected lots of other areas of my life. This, in connection with a tumultuous environment, was quickly pushing me to a breaking point. One night I awoke to this thing, something different perched on the bottom railing of my bed. The only way I can describe it was kind of like the fawn from Pan's Labyrinth. It looked much different than that character, but it's as close to an analog as I can come up with. It told me that it would get rid of the Gray Man, but for a price. The fawn had a different energy to it than the Gray Man did, but I don't think it was something that was of good intent, a mild, almost predatory opportunism at best. I was however desperate and exhausted, so whatever it wanted from me, whatever price it required, I paid it. It did indeed keep up its end of the bargain until I ended up accidentally opening up the door for this thing to re-enter. Some years later, my life did return to a kind of normal well in some ways. 2015, I am currently a resident of Altoona, Pennsylvania. I am writing this to report a strange encounter I experienced with a friend of mine in the early morning hours of the Sunday, March 17, 2013. The incident is now over 2 years old. I chose not to report this event prior to now due to an unwillingness to expose myself, or my family and friends, to public scrutiny. In light of the recent spate of similar sightings in central Pennsylvania, I have changed my mind. Perhaps our experience will help with the current research. As such, I would like to make my intention clear that myself and any persons mentioned please retain anonymity at this time. Reporting a Bigfoot or even an UFO sighting is one thing, but this is somewhat different. On the evening in question, a friend and I were returning from a job that I had performed in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. My friend was driving. To the best of my memory, the incident occurred somewhere between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m. on the morning of March 17. We were traveling SW on Route 22 through what is locally known as Geesey Town, a rural suburb of Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. As we rounded a little curve in the road, our attention was drawn to our left on the opposite side of the road. Standing/squatting in a clearing a few feet off the side of the road was some kind of creature. My friend wasn't driving very fast and slowed a bit as we approached. Our initial view of it was from its dorsal side, as it was facing away from us. It came into profile as we passed with its right side to us. It struck me immediately that the creature seemed to combine both human and canine features. It was squatting down on its legs close to the ground, but it was doing so in a bipedal fashion. The legs had the stifled joint and hock characteristic of a canine, not like a human leg. It had its front limbs/arms in front of it, and I believe it was possibly crouched over something, maybe a smaller animal. The arms were long in proportion to its body. I recall thinking the hands were more human-like as opposed to paws. Its torso seemed to be somewhat hunched forward. I had the impression that at any moment it could have gone to all fours quite comfortably. The creature's chest was not broad like a human's but had a pronounced forward-angled breastbone like a canid. It gave the impression of great strength, having distinct and well-defined musculature, but was not built on a massive frame. It seemed more thin and sinewy. If it had stood fully erect, I would estimate that the creature would have been close to 7 feet tall. It was covered in fur that was grayish-silver in color. The creature seemed unnaturally shiny, although this could have been a reflection from the headlights or the moon. It had pointy, erect canine ears that were somewhat laid back on its head. The head was large and very wolf-like in overall appearance. The muzzle was also very wolf-like/canid, although the snout wasn't exceptionally elongated. It had canine-like teeth. To the best of my recollection, the eyes were an amberish color but may have had a reddish glow/reflection to them. It had a wolf-like tail. It turned its head to watch us and tracked us as we passed. It seemed quite aware of our presence. My friend and I continued in stunned silence for a few moments. When the creature was no longer in view, I turned and asked my friend what we had just seen. His exact words were, "We just saw a werewolf." I agreed that that was pretty much my own assessment. I asked if he would turn the car around, but he absolutely refused to do so. We spent the rest of the trip debating as to whether it could have been a dog or even someone's escaped pet wolf, but to be honest, it just wasn't. I'm sure of that. Both my friend and I are experienced outdoorsmen, and neither one of us has ever seen anything fitting that description before. I was actually raised not far from the area and know it quite well. I have spoken to my friend about this, and either one of us would be willing to take a polygraph concerning this incident. Please feel free to contact me about any questions you may have. Thank you, name withheld. Notes from Lawn. I had the opportunity to speak to both witnesses. Each mentioned an interesting point, that this creature had a silvery aura around it. That's a very unique detail and may be an important point. This sighting, in particular, has raised my hackles a bit, because it suggests that a supernatural aspect may exist with this being. Butch Witkowski and I are familiar with some of the folklore associated with the Lenape, Delaware, people, who inhabited central Pennsylvania for many generations. Butch has already consulted a Cherokee shaman or elder who was referred to him by an associate. I plan to research more of the Lenape traditions for possible links to this being. Odd encounter in Shenandoah Valley. I go to school in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and in the summer of 2023, I was in my home late at night around 1 a.m. hanging out with my roommate at the time, and we live in a 3-story home. We're in the kitchen on the 2nd floor. And hear a faint moaning. We think it's the neighbors at first through the walls, but it starts to sound more like a baby, but not next door but outside, at our front door. We start to move toward the stairs to get a better listen, and whatever was there seems to start a scary thing and banging on the door heavily like a dog or big 4-legged animal. We are freaked out and don't know what to do. We sit in the living room, and this goes on for about 30 minutes, then after that time goes by, it's more on and off now, but I still can't go to sleep because how freaked out we were, and I lived on the 1st floor, so I was not going down there. It kept going on and on, so we decided to call the non-emergency police number. It started back up heavily now as we're on the phone with someone and we describe to the person on the phone what I mentioned before, and on the phone the person goes, "Is that the noise yours is describing?" I just heard it in the background, so we knew we were just hearing things. They said they would send someone, but no one came. So me and my roommate decided we were fed up. I grabbed a kitchen knife, and so did he, and we walked down the stairs as it was still scratching and banging as we went down. I got to the door and looked out the peephole, and nothing was there. We go back upstairs, and it starts again for around 10 minutes, and after that it stops. I eventually go downstairs and peacefully go to bed and wake up the next day and check outside, and nothing was there, no damage to the door, nothing at all. We still think about it to this day and are convinced it was a skinwalker. Does anyone have thoughts on this? Was it a skinwalker? A spirit? Anything else? I'm now a firm believer. The 2 other guys who were present also shared this belief. Anyway, I live in the Pacific Northwest on 82 acres, and it's pretty rural. My property backs up into thousands of acres of privately owned timber land, Weyerhaeuser, Port Blakely, etc. I have one neighbor about 100 yards past my house. We live on a dead-end road that just so happens to end at a cemetery. My property borders said cemetery. A few days ago, me and my buddy were loading up my truck and getting ready to go out and cut some firewood. It was about 5 a.m., so the sun wasn't up yet. I have a few brilliant LED auxiliary lights on my work truck. I mean, these things light up the night like it's daytime. I was parked facing my open field that has a heavily wooded tree line about 50 yards away from where we were parked loading up our gear for the day. I had all 6 of my lights blasting out into the field so we could see what we were doing. The field was lit up like the 4th of Duck in July all the way to the tree line and then some. Directly across from my field across the one-way dead-end road is my neighbor's house. He's about 100 yards away from my field up on a little bit of a hill. He has a perfectly clear view of my field and tree line. My buddy who was with me walked off to the side of my truck to pop a piss and get rid of some coffee. I was walking towards my shop to grab more gear, and I heard this weird screeching/howling sound. At first I thought my buddy was dragging something across the metal flatbed of my truck. I turned around to ask him what he was doing, and he's staring directly into the field towards the tree line. I look where he's staring, and I see something dark-colored hauling ass into the tree line. At first I thought it was a black bear. Pretty common around here. Then I realize it's walking on 2 feet with arms swinging by its side, taking huge strides. As quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. I'm in work mode, so I continue to head towards the shop to grab my chainsaw, not really registering what I had just seen. All of a sudden my neighbor's truck comes tearing us out of his driveway. I'm thinking, damn Jade, my neighbor, is in a big-ass hurry to get to work this morning. He comes flying into where my truck is parked and bails out of his truck and says, "Did you mother duckers just hear and see that shit?" Before I could respond, my buddy said, "Dude, what the duck was that?" And my buddy looks scared shitless. It all finally registers in my brain, and I say, "What was that howl/scream? And what the duck was that thing running into the woods?" Neighbor Jade says, "That was a goddamn Bigfoot, dude. No way in duck it was a bear. I watched it well into the tree line, and it stayed on 2 feet, running like a ducking human man." My buddy confirms this by nodding his head, and he's still white as a ghost. Around 5 a.m. I have heard that same howl or yell on several occasions. Witnessed by other people as well. Sometimes I can hear what sounds like big-ass sticks hitting something. I'm guessing a tree since it has that solid thud sound. Oddly enough, there has been a story I've heard from multiple people out here about an 8-foot-tall man. I always thought it was just some story to scare us kids. Now I'm thinking there's absolutely some truth behind it. I've always believed in cryptids and things of that nature. The property I live on has been in my family since the early 1900s. I inherited it a few years ago. I grew up here, then moved away for a while, and about 5 years ago I built a shop house on the edge of the property that's closest to the cemetery. This is unrelated to the Bigfoot stuff, but I've experienced things here that I don't tell people about because they'd think I was full of shit or just insane. Anytime I have guests over and we're hanging out late, something weird always happens. Recently, I've had a woman's hair pulled so hard that it unsnapped the hat she was wearing. Freaked her the duck out. A couple days later, my other friend and her girlfriend were here hanging out, and I was telling them about the chick that had her hair pulled. They were both chuckling a little bit, thinking I was trying to scare them. And right as the clock hit 3 a.m., all of us heard a lady speaking clear as day through the radio. She said, "Don't laugh. It's real." They both freeze and look scared shitless. I look up towards the speakers where the voice came from, and there is a kid-size handprint on the ceiling directly above the speaker. I know it wasn't there before because I just set the speakers up that day. The handprint is still there. I have an old dump truck parked in front of my shop that looks like it came out of a horror movie. One of my other friends says she always sees a weird-looking dude sitting in the truck. She calls him Dump Truck Dude. This chick is tough as nails, and I've never seen anything scare her before. She won't stay at my house past 2 a.m. anymore. These are just a few experiences that others have had at my house. I've personally experienced way more shit that I can't explain. So yeah, I'm 100% a firm believer in Bigfoot now. People can think this is just a story, but I don't give a duck. Whatever anyone says, I know what me and the 2 other witnesses saw. Opinions on this sighting from Central PA? I want to be clear from the beginning that I have no proof of the events I'm about to share with you, so I don't expect to be taken seriously by skeptics or to contribute to any significant body of scientific data. I'm simply looking for others who have had similar experiences. For background info, I live in the westernish part of central Pennsylvania on a dirt road in the middle of the woods. I don't want to say in exactly what county because I don't want anyone finding out where I live, lol, so I'm well accustomed to deer and their behavior. At the time of writing this, I've just come in from taking my 2 dogs, a Chihuahua and a Pomeranian, out to pee about 30 minutes ago and then taking time to compose myself to write this. As stated earlier, I live in the woods, so there's naturally a lot of predators that I don't want to get my dogs, so I only take them outside to pee or go for a walk on a leash for safety reasons. The whole time we were outside, the Chihuahua was barking, which isn't unusual for him because he's more prone to random outbursts of yapping. The Pomeranian usually only barks when we have guests or when he wants something. He never barks at deer or things outside when I take them out to pee or go for a walk. I thought nothing of it and kept walking them around our yard like I usually do. However, as I was walking past the small patch of barren ground that used to be my dad's garden, I spotted a deer. Again, I thought nothing of it and shouted get out at it so it would go away and stop sending my Chihuahua into a barking fit. It didn't budge at all. I got closer, and my Pomeranian started barking. I thought it was a little weird, but maybe he just had some pent-up energy or this specific deer smelt particularly interesting or tasty to him. I thought the dog's barking would run the deer off, but that didn't work either. Again, I didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary. Maybe this person was just really stupid and or deaf. So I shouted again, go on, get. Again, nothing. And that's when I noticed it. Its neck looked kind of weird? I don't know how to describe it. Its neck just looked really muscular and long, disproportionately so to the rest of its body. Now, I'm no stranger to cryptids and whatnot, I'm actually really into this kind of stuff, I just didn't think there was any merit to most of it until now. So, with that little nagging feeling in the back of my head, I become more determined to chase this damn thing off, be it a cryptid or an exceptionally stupid, stubborn deer. I start stomping my feet, flailing my arms, and screaming and carrying on. Still, the deer had no reaction. Not even a little step back. It just raised its neck up at me and looked me right in the eyes. I felt a chill go down my spine. I'm sure all of you know that look I'm talking about, the one you always hear about note deer having, that weird, eerie look of intelligence absent from normal deer, and that off-putting, impossible stillness. I stepped closer and amplified my screams. I was screaming at the top of my lungs at that point, and I was honestly half hoping my mother would come out of the house and ask me what the hell I was doing just so I wouldn't be alone with this damn thing. It stepped back, but only enough to cover itself in the shadows just outside of the reach of the porch lights, so I couldn't see its head and neck but could still see part of its body in the light. I'd had the light from my phone's flashlight on the whole time, but the light from the porch lights had been shining enough that there wasn't any glare to the deer's eyes. But when it stepped into the shadows, its eyes reflected yellow. Now, to anyone unfamiliar with deer, that might seem perfectly normal, but anyone who knows how animal eyes work would know that's not the color a deer's eyes are supposed to reflect. They normally reflect a whitish color. I'm not actually certain about that fact, so I disregarded it in the moment. I was getting frustrated and desperate to get rid of it at this point, so I pulled up the YouTube app on my phone and searched for predator sounds in the hopes that would finally deter it. Unfortunately for me, my phone ran out of power before I could even hit play on the coyote sounds. The deer stared me down in the awkward silence for a few moments, then stood up on its hind legs and walked off into the woods like a badly coordinated marionette, learning to walk in heels for the first time. My dogs both calmed down, and after I made sure it was actually gone, I booked it inside. I told my mom immediately, and she just brushed it off. I still don't know what to think of it, but I do know I'm not going outside after the sun sets ever again in case that thing comes back. I just can't fully accept that it was a cryptic, you know? Chronic wasting disease is a thing in my area, so maybe that could explain it? Maybe it really was deaf, or partially blind, or something, and that's why it didn't react to me? The hairy man. I didn't see anything about this here, so I thought I would tell you guys about a cryptid local to my hometown. In my hometown of Round Rock, he is known as the hairy man, and his description is fairly self-explanatory. He is a large humanoid figure covered in hair who lurks in the bushes along what is now called Hairy Man Road. According to the legend, he is human. But I don't like to believe that for myself. Life is more interesting with something left unexplained. They say that when he was a young boy traveling with a group, he became separated from his party and from there on out lived as a hermit. For years he went without human interaction, and he became violent toward anybody who dared enter his domain by the creek. People usually avoided his road in fear of encountering him. They say that one day he was run over by a wagon and died. However, people have still had sightings. Some people swear they still see a humanoid figure waiting in the bushes along Hairy Man Road. Others say they see him running through the brush. I've even heard some people say he jumped out onto the road and disappeared into the woods. However, no evidence of the hairy man seems to exist aside from sightings and legends. Could possibly be a sort of Sasquatch? Possibly just people seeing things? But all I know is that the people who live around that road have embraced the legend, and every year, they hold a festival in the hairy man's honor. Why my dad believes in Yetis. Bigfoot. My family is Russian. Both my parents are from Siberia, northern Russia, and were both born in a city called Omsk. Anyways, a couple of days ago, my dad and I got into a conversation that kept deviating from the original topic and eventually reached a point when we started talking about paranormal occurrences in our lives. I asked him why he believes in Yetis. A long time ago he told me he believes in Yetis but didn't explain why. My dad is not the type of guy who believes in paranormal activity. He thinks ghosts and aliens are all BS, and it was to my surprise that he believes in Yeti/Sasquatch/Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, he sits up straight, clears his throat, and tells me the following. My dad is 51 years old, and in his 20s, he served in the military. He served in a place called Sputnik, a village close to the Russian border with Norway. If you look it up, you can still see the barracks and the whole military camp itself, which is pretty fascinating. All heavy-duty military supplies were always stored far away, even from the military camps themselves, and kept as far out as possible from human activity, typically in a forest. One day, a group of 10 people, one of whom was my father, were tasked with going on an expedition to the warehouse to restock military supplies in the camp. This required many people because loading up the trucks with very heavy equipment and ammunition was a rather grueling task. My father gets in the truck together with the others and gets on the road. They reached the place far later than anticipated because of something along the lines of "we got a flat tire." The place they were going to is located near a city that's on the bank of one of the hundreds of rivers you can see on the map, and the place was called Levo Zero. They get there during the night. The only thing that was illuminating the forest were the stars. Since it was so dark and everyone was so tired, they decided to sleep over at the warehouse. They slept over at a dugout not too far away. Once they get there, everyone takes their spot on the floor and says goodnight. But no matter how much my dad was tired, he couldn't fall asleep. He stayed up for another 30 minutes before standing up and seeing everyone with their eyes open. No one was asleep. He had thought he was the only one awake, but he wasn't. The thing that was keeping him up was a sense of discomfort that he couldn't explain, and he decided to share this with the others. Everyone nods and says that they are all experiencing the same exact feeling. This wouldn't let them rest peacefully. Eventually, another 30 minutes go by, and the discomfort has now evolved into a mild fear and panic. At this point, everyone is really concerned because they've got to wake up early tomorrow to move heavy boxes, and sleeping was essential. They keep laying in silence. All of a sudden they hear a tremendous thump on the roof of the building. The thumping persists, and it sounds as if someone extremely heavy is walking on the roof. The roof was wooden, it was a sod roof with grass covering it, and my dad could tell for a fact it was someone walking because of the creaking the boards made. Simultaneously, everyone, as discovered the next day, starts hyperventilating, and everyone's hearts start beating extremely fast. The thumping the creature made was so loud it resonated in my dad's ears, and he felt his insides shake. One of the guys passed out. At a certain point the creature descended from the roof and started walking around the dugout, and one of the guys that was proud enough to open his eyes and look around said that the creature was peeking inside, but since it was dark, he could only see a silhouette. Eventually, whatever it was that was causing all of this left, and everyone went back to sleep. The next day, one of my dad's buddies asked a passing local about this phenomenon, and he said it was completely in the ordinary and even called it a specific name, which unfortunately my dad does not remember. Also, consider the fact that this all happened during the times of the Soviet Union. As you may or may not know, the Soviet Union was a complete atheist state. No cults, no belief in spirits, no religion. And people who believed in that sort of stuff were frowned upon. My father and the 9 other soldiers are ideology-packed elite troops, and honestly, hearing this from him sounded crazy, and I knew for a fact it was real. I may have encountered some kind of cryptid. A little backstory: I live in a rural area with my elderly grandfather and am his primary caretaker. We have very few neighbors, no sidewalks. A small town. We have very few break-ins or really any crime in general in this area. A lot of wooded areas and farmland. My house is surrounded by woods and has a tree line separating us from any of our neighbors. I have extensive firearm training and also have worked as a firearm instructor in the past. So last Friday, I'm sitting in my basement on my couch about to go to sleep. This is a pretty regular occurrence. My couch sits in front of a big window, the blinds always closed, and a glass door that leads outside, Covered with a semi-transparent shade, you can see through it but just barely, enough to make out silhouettes. It was almost 11 p.m., and I was watching a movie with headphones on when I thought I heard a noise outside, which is weird considering I was wearing headphones with the volume up pretty high. So I took off the headphones to listen more closely. I heard what sounded like footsteps in the gravel driveway just outside my door. But not walking, more like dancing or sprinting. Like they were moving very fast. At the time, I got up and looked out the glass door and saw nothing. So I chalked it up to it being an animal or something. I sat back down on the couch and was about to put my headphones back on when I heard 3 distinct taps on my window, just opposite my couch. Naturally, I am startled, because no one I know is going to do that. They would call me or just knock on my door. Especially this late at night. As I stand up again, I hear the gravel in the driveway rustling again, this time louder and as if someone is running away. The direction I heard them running is directly into a briar patch and densely wooded area. So, I grab my rifle that I keep in the closet just beside the basement door and step outside. Using the flashlight attached to the rifle, I scan the tree line, looking for possible threats, because I'm convinced at this point some people are here to rob me. I see nothing and go back inside, thinking maybe still, probably more trying to convince myself, perhaps it could have been an animal of some sort. At this point I turn off all the lights inside and stand just behind the glass door with the shade, with the outside floodlights on. This way, I could see outside and no one could see in. Just watching. Making sure everything is okay before I go to bed. It's extremely quiet outside. Like in scary stories, when they say even the bugs and birds are silent, that was happening. Not a cricket or locust, not anything was making a sound. As I'm almost ready to give up and say it was just my imagination, I see a flicker of light in the woods in front of me. If I had to guess, maybe the size of a dime, like a reflection of my house lights into metal or something. Followed by the bushes rustling. So, once again, I step outside and yell hey. Seeing if I could scare whatever it was away. And I hear a loud whisper, that's the best way I can describe it. It was a whisper but loud enough for me to hear from about 100 feet away, say hey. Back to me. At this point I'm freaked out, and I know it's another person. So I shoulder my rifle, point the mounted flashlight back into the woods again, and yell back to them, wrong house, mother ducker, get off my property unless you want to die tonight. Or something along those lines. At that moment, to my right, I hear a person whistle softly. It sounded kind of like they were mimicking a bird. 2 soft whistles. Coming from the same tree line just further to the right. At that point, I turn and aim my rifle about 20 feet short and to the left of the tree line, not in the exact direction of the noises in case it was just some dumb kids just pulling a prank or something, and fire 5 shots into the ground to scare whoever it was away. I kept the flashlight pointed at the tree line, scanning for any movement. My neighbor's dog started barking, I assume at the gunshots. I never saw any movement, anyone scattering, never heard footsteps running away, nothing at all. So I walked down to the right side where the whistle came from. The woods are not as dense as there are no briar bushes there, and continued to look through the woods looking for any sign of people. I still never saw anyone. As I'm walking back up to my house, wondering what the hell just happened, my grandfather, 84M, meets me at the door, asking me what happened. He is still of sound mind, not so much physically. So I explained to him what happened, loaded his revolver, and set it by his bedside in case someone tried to break in during the night. We sleep on opposite ends of the house and on separate floors, so I thought this was the safest option. After I get him back to bed, I go to the upstairs kitchen and get a bottle of water from the fridge. As I close the refrigerator door, I hear footsteps. On the roof of our 2-story house. The lowest point of our roof would require a ladder to access. I mean, an Olympic high jumper couldn't make that leap. My whole body is covered in chills at this point. The hair on the back of my neck is standing up. Utter fear is the best way to explain it. My grandfather, being almost deaf, of course didn't hear it, and I'm sure he was already back asleep. I froze. Listening. The footsteps were heavy, grown man-sized. Walking slowly from his room to the kitchen area where I'm at. There is a skylight on the roof of the kitchen. I remain still and look up towards it. Praying like hell, nothing would be looking back at me. I waited a few minutes, the footsteps continued. Back and forth from one side of the house to the other. I decided to run back downstairs. Quickly I grab my rifle and run outside. Not knowing at this point what I'm even dealing with. Just relying on my training to be able to neutralize the threat if need be. I try to calm myself, focusing on controlling my breath, as I go to the front yard and begin to scan the roof with my weapons-mounted flashlight. I see nothing. I walk around the house, scanning the trees and roof for any signs of anyone or anything. Again, I saw nothing. I repeated this twice, yelling out a few times, "I'd coo you are, but you better get the duck out of here." Eventually I gave up, returning inside to watch TV with my rifle in my hand all night. And that was the end of it. No weird or unnatural occurrences since that night. Needless to say, the last few nights have been rough, with little to no sleep. I'm still unsure what exactly happened. I've never had hallucinations before, and I'm not sure even hallucinations could be that real. I told some family and friends what happened, and they all kind of brushed it off. They said I could have imagined the footsteps, or the whistle could have been a bird, it was kids playing a prank, etc., but I'm not so sure. All this has left me wondering a few things. Am I crazy? Did I hallucinate all of it? If I did, why did the hallucinations only last for one night? Could it have been an extremely well executed prank? Sure, I guess. Although I'm not sure who would do that and not have jumped out with cameras after or something, announcing it was a prank. The whistle could have been a bird noise, sure, I'm not a bird expert. But the loud whispering hey? Or the distinct loud footsteps on the roof after? I don't think birds can speak or grow to be 200 plus pounds. Anyway, that's my story. It's the first possible cryptid encounter I've ever had. I've experienced some weird unexplainable things in my past, but I'm a skeptic at best as far as paranormal things. But that encounter definitely freaked me out and has me questioning things now. My Michigan Dogman encounter in the eastern Upper Peninsula. My Dogman encounter happened on season opener in November of 2013 in the eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan on family hunting property near a town called Cedarville. The house my husband and I were staying in up there had a big front yard, but other than that cleared area and the gravel driveway, everything else is pretty deep hardwood forest. I also want to state ahead of time that this happened at around 11 p.m., so everything that's beyond the porch lights was pretty hard to see. My husband and I had gone outside to have a cigarette, and we took our rifle out with us whenever we were hanging around out because there's bears and stuff back there in that area. I was up on the porch still, and my husband had gone down the steps into the yard and was facing towards me when we heard these really heavy, slow footsteps coming up the driveway through the woods. It sounded like a really big man, but there was this weird heavy breathing too, and the footsteps, even though they sounded like a person, sounded heavier than anything I had ever heard walking in the woods, including a full-sized adult bear. My husband looked at me and mouthed, "WTF?" And I was trying to figure out what it was that I was hearing, but nothing I had ever heard out there in those woods in my whole life matched the size and breathing and gait of whatever this was, so I was confused and shaking my head. My husband isn't a hunter and grew up in the city, so he was completely confused too. I've hunted and tracked basically everything that's indigenous to northern Michigan since I was small, so I was honestly terrified that this animal was a complete unknown to me by sound. It walked out of the tree line at the edge of the yard behind my husband, and it was a lot taller than him, at least 7 feet tall or more, and I'd estimate the weight for its size at around 400 pounds. It was on 2 legs and had super dark black fur that was somehow even darker than the nighttime dark of the woods. It was walking back and forth at that distance from us the whole time this encounter happened, but it would not step into where the perimeter of the porch light was. I had a really hard time making out its torso for that reason, but I saw a wolf-like head and snout with pointed ears that stuck straight up, and instead of front legs and paws, it had really disproportionately long arms and hands. It was on 2 legs this whole time, walking back and forth. I freaked out and grabbed the rifle and just started shooting at it and yelling at my husband to run and get up on the porch, so he did, and then he took the gun from me and told me to find something to use as a weapon and to go inside and hide, so I did. I got a big knife and went and locked myself in our bedroom in the closet and could hear my husband shooting and reloading a bunch for about another 10 minutes. He came in and told me through the closet door that the Dogman had finally run off, but he wasn't sure if it was going to possibly come back, so we were both pretty terrified, and I ended up staying in that closet all night until sunrise with my husband guarding the door with the gun. He told me that he thought I had hit it when I was shooting at first, but the next day we didn't find any blood, hair, or anything, which I thought was weird because I really thought I must have shot and wounded it a couple times. It moved incredibly fast though and was agile enough to run through the brush and stuff without really mowing it down or making a bunch of noise like big animals usually do running through dense underbrush and stuff. The whole encounter was incredibly weird and scary. My husband also said that he did see it sort of hunch over and drop down onto all fours a few times while it was running back and forth at the edge of the yard, but that when it ran away for good that night that it was running insanely fast and on 2 legs like a man. We didn't smell anything bad like a lot of people describe when they see these things, and it didn't even leave any noticeable tracks anywhere, even though the thing was so heavy when it was walking up the gravel driveway that I swore the ground near it must have been shaking. We found out later from one of the neighbors that he had seen it too next door the winter before when it came up on the porch of his cabin and looked in the door window during a party he and his wife had been throwing. He said he heard really heavy footsteps on the porch and pulled back the curtain on the window, and the Dogman was standing there on the other side of the glass looking down at him, but that its fur was white then. I think that's probably because there was snow on the ground at this point in the year. My neighbor hollered at everyone in the cabin and told them what he had just seen, and then everyone decided to make a run for it through the woods to his mom's house next door since her place was a lot sturdier than the hunting cabin. I've known that neighbor my whole life practically since high school, and he would never make something like that up. He was scared even while he was just talking about it. I also read somewhere online recently that another family about 45 miles north of our area had a bunch of livestock like cows and horses turn up dead and torn up by some kind of big predator, and that one of the guys in the family saw a giant upright wolf back near his hunting blind during deer season, which of course freaked me out since we had our experience on season opener. The land butting up to that family's property is hundreds of miles of the Hiawatha National Forest, so it would make sense to me that a big animal would hide in and near a protected area like that when it's hearing gunshots everywhere else. My lot and my neighbor's lot are also right alongside state land. My husband and I moved since this all happened, but the experience was so upsetting to me that I constantly research online to see if anyone else has seen this thing up north and what their encounter was like and stuff. I've even heard that there's a small pack of about 4 or 5 of them that live in state forest downstate in Isabella County that a bunch of locals in the nearby area have seen, and that somebody even observed one at night in downtown Saginaw, Michigan. What scares me about that is the fact that there's no tree cover there, as that's a city. I wonder if people all over the state are seeing these animals because they're getting forced out of their usual hunting territories due to hunting, logging, and mining that's really increased over the years here. If anyone else from Michigan has an experience to share, please let me know, even if you would feel more comfortable sharing through a private message. I'm also available to talk with anyone who maybe even is just messed up as I am overseeing one of these things, or if anybody has any questions. Be careful out there, everybody. Southern tier of upstate New York sighting of unknown creature. Backstory: I'm not going to specify where I live for obvious reasons, but I was at my friend's apartment. It's located on a main road that's mostly businesses and industrial, so we're pretty secluded. It's a basement apartment below a business. I grew a shitload of weed earlier this year, so my friend and I have become degenerate stoners. I would also like to say that I do not hallucinate from smoking cannabis. I smoke it a lot and never see anything or hear anything unexplainable. This cannabis was grown indoors in soil and with organic dry amendment fertilizer and earthworm castings. That's it. I grew it. It wasn't the weed, especially because I wasn't high when this happened. It was probably somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m., and I was doing my usual routine of packing a fat bowl to rip. We aren't allowed to smoke in the apartment, but there are stairs that lead to a back porch. Now I've gone out there to smoke a lot of times, and I've seen a lot of wildlife. I actually used to live in the same apartment, so I have gone outside to smoke at least 100 times. I've seen pretty much all the wildlife in the area. Feral cats, one of which I rescued, and you can see him on my profile, foxes, coyotes, skunks, woodchucks, bobcats, and a lot of white-tailed deer. I've seen deer so many times, more than any other animal. I've seen them during the day and especially in the middle of the night. I used to like to stare them down and start jogging at them to freak them out. I'm an asshole, I know, but it freaks me out when they just freeze up and stare at me while I'm trying to smoke. So I go outside to smoke and do my usual scan of my surroundings. I have visual snow and mild night blindness, but I've had that my whole life. Actually, because of this and my anxiety, I take a few moments to really scan my surroundings before relaxing to smoke. To my right is a field that ends at a tree line bordering an old business. This is where I usually see wildlife the most. Well, I saw something that I cannot identify. It was shaped, colored, and moved like no other creature I've seen. My best description would be a creature resembling a pony in size and movement, but it didn't have the defined head and neck of a pony. It looked almost completely white, but not ghostly white. More of a grayish white. It didn't seem to have much of a neck, and the head wasn't really there. If it was, then its neck was the same size as its head. Keep in mind, my vision stinks at night. Also keep in mind, it has sucked every time I've seen a deer right at the same spot. This wasn't a deer. At first my brain told me it was a deer, but then I noticed it was way too low to the ground. Its legs were too short. It was moving, and my subconscious was yelling at me that it was not a deer. It moved more like a horse at a slow trot. It trotted down the tree line, then started galloping around the side of the business, and I last saw it in the parking lot before it left my sight. This is weird because usually when I go outside in the middle of the night to smoke and I see deer, they either freeze up staring at me or immediately take off running. This thing would have been able to see me illuminated on the porch, but it didn't seem to react. I know it wasn't a pony, though. I've seen ponies, and that wasn't one. There also aren't any places around here that would keep one, and I didn't find any reports of a missing pony in the area. It just didn't seem right. Not in a frightening way, but in the duck is that way. So anyway, I smoked my bong rip in one inhale because I'm a degenerate and went back inside. I told my friend about it, and he got all freaked out. We both know about cryptids, and my friend is scared of skinwalkers, so I joke about it sometimes. He is convinced it was a cryptid of some sort, but I can't find anything online resembling what I saw. I also looked at a website that shows all the possible mammals in your area. I've seen every one other than bears, but it looked too light in color to be a bear. The shape wasn't really right either. Anyone know what this could be? Could it be an animal or a cryptid? I'm thinking about getting a trail cam and setting it up on that tree line, but I'm on a fixed income, so I try not to spend money on things I won't use for the long term. A tale of a creature that turns into an owl. I'm Latina, so in our culture we are gifted jewelry at a young age. When I was little, my mom purchased a necklace that has the Virgin Mary on it with diamonds surrounding it. I was around the age of 14 years old, I believe. I decided to go outside to jump on the trampoline we had. Yes, it was pretty late. I can't really say what time it was, but it was pretty dark out, but my mom had porch lights that face out to light up the front yard. So I'm jumping and enjoying the alone time when all of a sudden a bird came down and snatched my necklace off of me. I freaked out because the bird with its wings spread out was taller than me at the time. It felt like it could literally come down and snatch me if it wanted to. So I ran in and told my mom that a bird snatched my necklace. I was so upset and confused because my mom didn't believe me, and she thought I lost it when playing outside. The very next morning, my mom is in the kitchen making coffee and pancakes for us before going to school. My mom has a little window above her sink where she can look out to the backyard, and right next to that window is an old tree. We lived in this house for 20 years now, and the tree was there before we moved into it. Anyway, my mom looks out, and hanging from the window was my necklace. My mom was so confused because if I lost it in the front, why was it in the back hanging by the window? My dad gets a ladder to get it. My mom sat me down and told me a tale. That witch can turn into owls. My mom believes a witch was watching me and that we need to tell the witch/owl to stay away from me. She said they can be bad, but there are some people who believe they can be good. My mom put the necklace back on me. That night my mom heard an owl, and she thinks it was resting on that tree. But it was screeching and clicking. Honestly, I don't know if owls make those kinds of noises, but my mom was not having it and went to the back porch and yelled, "We don't want you here. We don't need your company. You are to leave this property and leave this family alone." This was the polite way to put it because originally she was speaking Spanish and cussing it out. I never had another experience with an owl after that until maybe 5 years ago. I used to work a midday shift from 12:30 to 9 p.m. and I would have to get my daughter from my mom after work to go home. Well, that's what I did, and I was driving, and it was dark, and leaving my mom's home, something landed on top of my car, but I thought it was maybe like trash or a branch fell. Kept going, came to a stop, and an owl flew over to an extinguisher that was on the side of the road and just stared at me. I took my phone out to take a picture, but when I did it flew away, so I was like, okay, it's just an owl, and it's not what my mom told me years ago. So I didn't see it anymore, I continued, and then the owl flew along me past me onto a stop sign, and then I just started to freak out and I started yelling at it. Telling it to leave us alone, and we don't want anything to do with you. I just did what my mom did when it happened before. I never saw it again, and I never experienced it again. When my daughter was born 8 years ago, I gifted her that same necklace my mom gifted me, and she still wears it to this day. I'm not sure if anyone can tell me if it's true about the tale my mom told me when I was younger. Maybe it was just an actual owl praying for food, and I saw it right? Ike. Hi. I don't really know how to start this. This is my first one. At the time of writing this, I am living in western Pennsylvania, a little south of Pittsburgh. I was in Boy Scouts for most of my life, so I feel very comfortable in the woods and go camping often. Upon hearing Governor Wolf's school closure plan, I decided that it was time for some cold weather camping. It was March, it wasn't that cold, but it did drop to 40 degrees at night, and the people who I went weren't really avid campers. If you're from Pittsburgh, you may know the Boggs campsite on the Montour Trail. That's where we went. They, of course, only brought weed and alcohol and didn't bring any sleeping bags, blankets, or pillows, so naturally I assumed they were going to have to sit by the fire all night. It was light when we first got there, and the fire pit was still smoldering, very cool. We used the coals from the previous camper's fire to light ours, and immediately I knew that I would have to provide wood for the fire until I went to bed. They passed out beers at around 3 p.m. Times are going to be a bit dodgy because I wasn't near my phone, and after having 2 to 3 beers, I just wanted dinner. Now, that's what they did for me. They made ramen noodles and cheese, which was amazing. They had a weird name for it, and burgers over the fire. By this time it would have had to have been close to 5 p.m. because it started to rain a little bit, as was forecasted, so we took shelter in the lean-to shelter that was on site, and occasionally one of them would throw some sticks on the fire. Woods were all they seemed to be able to find even though I brought 2 saws and an axe, and I would cut up some logs. By the time the rain stopped, all 4 of us had smoked a blunt and were sitting around the fire. I was light out, so well, call it 7 p.m. after a while of just hanging out, they asked if I had any blankets. I always have blankets. Nothing special, but we've had some pretty bad snowstorms in the past, and a couple scratchy car blankets are always useful. They each got a blanket except for R, as we'll call him, who got my summer sleeping bag that I brought just in case. By now it was dark, 9 to 9:30 p.m. and the fire was getting low. I start off to find some more wood because they wanted to smoke another blunt. Now you have to understand that I'm 6 feet 5 inches and a semi-frequent user of the devil's lettuce, so my tolerance is kind of high. I return with the wood, and we spark up another blunt, a smaller one, and just kind of hang out and talk and listen to music while we're high as shit. Good times. Eventually the fire, again, dies down a little bit, and, again, it's my job to get more wood. Because we had been there for a while and there were people there before us, most of the wood near the shelter was either really small or all used up, so I had to keep going farther and farther away from camp to find wood. 12:30 a.m., close to 50 F still, so we were all doing well. I have a flashlight, a really nice one that I use for scuba diving, that is kind of bright, so I use it on the low setting on land. At this point I'm far enough away from camp that my friends can't really see me. There's like an embankment between the mountain trail and someone's driveway that you have to cross to get to more woods, but I'm comfortable alone because I knew what I was doing and they could hear me if I needed them. I start to hear a weird whistling sound, kind of like someone inhaling through a snorkel, but I chalk it up to the wind. The air was starting to get kind of cold, so I just took back what I had and put some on the fire. 1 to 2 a.m., 40 F with some wind, nothing severe. I have on 2 long sleeve shirts and an army surplus coat that is super warm, but my friends are in windbreakers and hoodies, and, oh yeah, it's raining. Off to get more wood. This time I started taking into consideration the type of wood that I would collect. There was a lot of pine, but that burns fast, which is why I had to go collect it so often. The stretch of wood near the driveway was pretty much all pine, a few maples, but nothing big. So I keep walking, knowing that this area has both conifers and deciduous trees in close proximity to each other. As I'm wandering and collecting wood, I notice that the rain has turned to a superfine snow. Time to head back, just in case it picks up. Then the whistling started again, a lot louder now. Okay, weird, there isn't any more wind than there was before, maybe it changed directions. I kept walking. By now I can hear the music from camp and pick up the pace a little bit. Just as I summit the embankment and prepare to clamber down the other side, a loud noise echoes behind me. Tree fell? Shining my flashlight around, I couldn't see any signs that was the case and didn't see any source. Deer knocked something over? In my head, it doesn't matter because I'm back at camp anyway, and I can try the marsh behind our shelter next time. 3 a.m.? They were cold. The temperature dropped to around 30 F, and the wind and snow had picked up. Car blankets helped the boys a little bit, but they weren't able to go sleep in the tent that I brought without freezing, except for R, who slept like a rock all night after about 3:30. We decide to finish off the weed and give the last beers a good talk. 4:30 a.m., I'm about ready for bed at this point because I'm not super high or drunk or anything, but I was definitely tired. I offer to go collect more wood before I retire to my 0-degree sleeping bag and cot. I camp comfy when I don't have to carry it far, and they said they would join me. They must have been cold. We split up, and I end up heading back to where I was before, except this time I left my flashlight on high and I made a bunch of noise to scare off that deer or whatever that was there earlier. I end up a little further away from camp than I had intended to be because there were only pine branches on the ground over here. Then the whistling starts again. This time I could tell the direction it was coming from, my left, and shine my flashlight around that area before just returning to collecting wood. Then the sound stops briefly, then picks up again in a different direction less than a minute later, this time in front of me and a little to the right, back into the pines. Maybe the branches of certain trees catch the wind just right and make the noise, I think whatever and move on. Then, on my way back, the noise was following me, darting from left to right but always like right behind me. I don't see anything, so whatever. Then the noise makes like one sharp whistle and pauses, and then I hear it. Damn, it's cold out here. It was R, but I couldn't find him with my flashlight, so I called where you at, and it sounded like he turned around because I heard a branch snap and a bit of movement. I pointed my flashlight at where the sound was coming from, and I didn't see her anywhere. Maybe he's behind a bush or a tree or something. I call out again, R? No reply this time. Yikes. He might be lost or something because we weren't at camp and he saw my flashlight moving, so he came to look. R, where are you? Nothing. Then, louder, I'm going back to camp, because I thought he was trying to scare me. Shining my flashlight around one last time, I spot something dive into a bush about 40 feet from where I had heard her turn around. I see you, big man. Grab some wood and come back. He's 6 and 230 to 250 pounds. I shine the light around for a few more seconds, then turn around again and start walking. The whistling is back. Cool, love that. No matter what speed I moved at, it always seemed the same distance away. I decide that I'd just kind of sit under a tree and wait for R to pass by because he had to come back sometime, right? I wanted to save the battery of my flashlight, so I turned it off and closed one eye so it would adjust faster. By now the snow had picked up a good bit, which is another reason to stop in case I got lost. I couldn't really see super far because there was a lot of cloud cover despite it being a full moon. The whistling never got closer, but it did start to move around a little bit, in a really odd circle. It would start in one spot, stop, then promptly start in another spot that was in a different direction. I realized that it had to be the wind or something because it was moving super fast and was moving at random. Cool, now where the duck is R. I turn on my flashlight between whistles and call out again, R? It's important to note here that the whistling never picked up while I looked around. It normally only stopped for a second or two. It was super quiet. The snow was laying on the ground, and we had 2 to 3 inches on the ground by now, so maybe that muffled it?
Anyways, upon not hearing R, I thought that maybe I missed him or didn't hear him at all and started to head back to camp.
As I stood up and brushed the dirt off my ass, I shined the flashlight around one more time. I was thinking in my head, I definitely heard him. After I stood up with the wood in my arms and began to walk back towards camp, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. My flashlight, being a diving light, has a wrist mount that I was wearing so I could use it and carry things. I turned towards and scanned the area with my flashlight. Nothing, duck and deer. Not even 4 steps more, and I saw another movement. Now the whistling was back. Damn, that gets annoying. It sounds like a fat guy who just ran up the stairs. Flashlight was on low, so I could see maybe 40 feet around me and didn't see anything, but I knew it was time to pick up the pace. Now the whistling was followed by flashes of movement. Great, it's not the wind. At this point, I'm speed walking. Being tall, I can move if I have to, and I was definitely traveling at jogging speed.
R, a lumbering beast when he runs, could not move this fast or this quietly through the woods.
Nice, another thing that's not. I decided to turn off the flashlight and move into some brush that was close by. Not sure why, but I was getting a little weirded out and had the shakes even though I was warm. It was silent again. Well, duck me, what is it? Is it hunting me? Coyote? Not a coyote. There was a good period of silence, then there was whistling. This time it wasn't doing circles around me, it was just moving around where I had turned off the flashlight. My eyes adjusted, and I peeked out from under the bush that I was rolled up under. I tried. Nothing, just that damned whistling. By this point I was pretty much sober, like if I got pulled over I could nail the field sobriety test. I waited for a little while the thing just kind of looked around. Then I heard it speak. In a really gargled impression of me, it called out big man. It took everything I had not to panic. Holy shit. Not R, not human, not a deer, not the wind. Oh duck. Then it spoke again, R, cutting off really strangely like you just lifted the needle off of a record but picking back up again with back to camp still in my voice. My ducking voice. I normally don't like hearing recordings of myself anyway, but now I really don't like them. It said a few more things, in different voices that I didn't recognize. All the voices were either talking about how cold it was or asking questions like what was that? And stop ducking with me, but they all seemed like whoever was talking had some phlegm built up in their throat. Then it went quiet. I poked my head out of the bushes again and saw something sitting against a tree in the same position I had been in, left leg straight out, right leg at an angle, hands behind my head. It could have fooled me as being R, we both kind of sit the same way except his ADHD usually makes him fidget with his hands. Okay, so who's sitting in the woods with me? I lay there silent and just watched. It begins to whistle, so that's where that was coming from. It moves its hand around and a fist out in front of it, the same way that I look around with my flashlight, and then starts to stand up. Oh duck, it's tall. I only weigh 166, skin and bone mostly, so when I say that this thing is skinny, don't take it lightly. I could see how thin its long, spindly arms were silhouetted against the snow that coated a bush behind it. When it stood up, it was hunched over. Not sure if I was slouching when I stood up, but I certainly do slouch. It walked a few paces away from the tree and stood up the whole way. Holy shit. I worked with backdrops for theater productions, and the walls we use the most are around 8 feet high, and this thing would have easily been able to see over one. I'm talking by at least a foot. It slowly peered around, no hair on its head, and its side profile showed a super disfigured skull. The jaw hung pretty far down, and there weren't really lips that stuck out, but it was hard to tell because of how dark it was. It let out one final R? Big man, kind of like someone with tortures would say it because they were just random words that it strung together. Then it scrambled. My dad used to take me to air shows a lot as a kid, and this has to have been the same pitch and volume as an F-16. I couldn't move. It peered around, its head just seemingly sweeping the area. Then it crouches down and leaps for a tree with the lowest branch being around 10 to 15 feet and lands feet first on one of the branches and sits there, squatting, whistling, and just staring around. Then it takes off. Faster than should be allowed in nature. I count to 10 in my head. The forest sleeps. I slowly make my way out from under the bush and begin to creep back towards camp, this time avoiding using my flashlight or making any noise if possible. I climb the embankment and take one last look towards the woods, unsure if that just happened or if I was asleep. I tumble down the other side of the embankment and return to the relative safety of the big-ass fire with Y and J, the other two who went for wood. "Where's your wood?" asks Y. "Oh, it, had bugs. It's fine, we got a lot anyway." They stacked up a solid pile of oak and pine, not enough for the night but enough for a little while at least. "Where's R?" I ask warily. "Check the tent." There he was past the duck out, snoring the way he always does. Well, okay, then. I climbed into my sleeping bag to warm up a little bit because I was covered in snow when I got back, and it screamed again. "Oh, please don't tell me it's coming here." The other two looked at me wide-eyed. Normally if I recognize a sound, I say what it is out loud so they know what's up. I had no response. They asked if I heard the first one. Good, they heard it too. I answered with a nod as I unlocked the car in case we needed to book it. They asked if I saw it. Nod. What was it? No ducking clue. I described it to them quietly so that I could listen for more noises, and I told them about it imitating my voice. Y was pretty freaked out. Jay thought I was bullshitting him and said it was some kind of owl. I got out of my sleeping bag, threw my coat back on, and joined them at the fire. For the first time in a while, I looked at my phone at 5:45 a.m. We looked up native owl calls and came up empty-handed. The same happened with every other animal we tried. Jay seemed a little nervous. Y suggested that maybe it's a truck on the highway. "Yeah, that's probably it," I replied blankly, and Jay gave me a look that said that he knew it probably wasn't. They didn't sleep. I forced sleep upon myself so that we wouldn't die on the car ride home. The next morning we went for a walk. It didn't snow much after I got back, so you could kind of follow my footprints. The tree the thing leapt into was out of reach of me on Jay's shoulders, or was still asleep, but I think I might have been able to reach it if I was on his. The tree I sat under had scratch marks on it. I think they're from deer shedding the velvet off of their antlers, but it creeped me out nonetheless. The tree it sat under had footprints everywhere. There seemed to be no order to them at all. It was amazing. It looked like it had run over every square inch of that area, coming as close to the bush I was in as 2 me lengths. I don't really know much about cryptids or anything, but when I got home, I googled North American tall skinny cryptid, and the second result was from Parade, a list of cryptids. After ruling out everything else on the list, I came across the picture of a Wendigo that has antlers, not quite but pretty close, described as tall and skinny and super fast. I did my research, and every picture has antlers, but I can't find any evidence that, other than a few movies, it had antlers. I don't cow. What I saw definitely didn't have antlers, but it matched everything else, down to the whistling. This was kind of long, but I'd appreciate some feedback. Probably nothing, but thoughts on this deer encounter? I do not think this was not deer. But it involved deer, it felt off, and I don't know where else to ask. This happened a couple months ago, but I still think about it. I live in rural PA and was coming home from work at night. I was on a back road that I've had paranormal experiences on while driving it over the years. One being that I had to swerve for a woman who suddenly appeared on the road in the middle of the night and then was gone, and another where I got a glimpse in my headlights of something bipedal with a weird gait run up a bank. I still take this road most days though because it's pretty hard to avoid. So this night at about 9 p.m., I came around a curve to a deer laying awake in the road in my lane. It was holding its head up. I assumed it had been hit and was injured. I stopped the car and started texting a friend, wondering if I should report it and to where. I inched up the car a few times to see if it would get up, but I didn't beep my horn because of a nearby house. The deer was fully awake and was looking in my direction. I sat there for at least 5 minutes, still messaging back and forth with my friend. I felt bad that I was probably scaring it. Then, the deer looked to the left, of my car very quickly, like it was surprised by something. I looked to the side and in my mirrors but didn't see anything or anyone. About 5 seconds after that, something big ran into the back of my car. It was loud, and I felt it. The deer jumped up right after it happened and stood there still. I looked in my mirrors and put my car in reverse just to look in the backup cam, but unfortunately I couldn't see what might have hit me. The deer slowly walked to the other side of the road and appeared uninjured. It just stood there calmly near the edge and looked at me/my car. I felt pretty freaked out by whatever hit my car and also had the thought that it could be a person, so I drove away. There were no marks on my car when I got home. I do think the deer was hit and just in shock. I've had deer run into the side of my car while driving, but would another deer just run into the back of my parked running car that had been sitting there for 5 minutes already? I'd what else it could have been though. I might just be overly paranoid because the impact spooked me and the things I've seen on this road were very weird, so I'm already on alert there. But I see deer every single day, in my backyard and while driving, so it's not that they freak me out normally. What do you think? Whole lot of nothing? I live in a quiet and secluded area in Michigan. During winter, the forest animals usually find dens and holes to hide in. So you don't usually see them wandering about. Lately, though, I started seeing more shadows moving around the trees. It wasn't completely out of the usual. Animals still needed to find food and do other things animals do. Lately it was the deer that were coming around more. I would see them out the window picking at half-frozen shrubbery and digging at tree roots. Again, it wasn't ever anything outside of the usual. Even if they were coming pretty close to the house. The problem started the month I was left alone. My mom and dad trusted me enough to watch over the house while they went on a business/sightseeing trip. I had had some friends over, and we were just sitting around talking, all of us piled into the house's living room. I should tell you, and I don't mean to brag, but the house was big. It was my dad's pride and joy. He and my uncles had spent a fortune renovating and decorating the place. It looked like one of those houses you'd see in a furniture magazine. So obviously I was the host for every get-together. There were 5 of us sitting in front of the fireplace that day: Sam and his girlfriend Dankia, Anika and her girlfriend, the vape pen in her pocket, Mitch, my best friend since middle school, and me. We'd started the gossiping, spearheaded by Danica, who loved to comment on everybody at our high school. It was fine though, usually because we always shared the same sentiments as her. I think we were discussing one of the bitchy cheerleaders when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the motion lights in our backyard snap on. I brushed it off. Living next to the woods gets you used to all sorts of stuff. We kept talking until the lights snapped on again, and this time I took notice. More out of boredom than interest. I regret looking at that ducking deer that was standing about 20 yards from the sliding glass door. What the duck? I breathed, catching Mitch's attention. You good, dude? He asked before he caught sight of the deer. Hey, deer aren't usually like that, right? Mitch was born in the city an hour from my house. He had gone on a few hunting trips with me and my dad but was otherwise aloof to woods things. I stood up, and everyone else went quiet. Danica gasped when she saw it too. Sam stood up and walked to the door. He was confident as always, and I joined him in staring at the malformed deer. I've avoided describing this thing for a solid reason. It was disgusting. It looked like walking roadkill. Its neck was all bent, and its front legs were buckled and shaking slightly. One eye was gone, and there was a ragged hole in its side where you could see its ribs. Holy, Anika said as she approached the door. What do we do? She asked me. CWD probably. Let's stay inside and call it in. They'll send someone out to deal with it soon. I turned away and went to the phone, but Danica stopped me. It looks like it's in pain. Can't we help it now? I shot her a hard look, but she had a point. I hated seeing it like that, knees all bent and broken, but CWD was dangerous. And I had no intention of screwing with what could be a zombie virus. A couple years back, a neighbor had found a deer with the disease in his yard too. He'd called, but it took almost a whole week for the DWR to send a team. I was considering the options when I heard Anika scream, Then I heard a loud thud. I rushed from the kitchen towards the door and found myself staring at that ducking deer standing right outside the door. I called the police. They said they're on their way. I told my friends that as we huddled in my room, Danica was hugging Sam and breathing unevenly. He was doing his best to comfort her. Anika was pacing, and Mitch was busy looking out the window. The deer had run towards the door downstairs and smashed its head against the glass. My dad had put some beefy glass in those doors. A couple months back we had a branch go straight through it during a storm. The deer also had broken antlers and a broken neck. So it didn't do much. Still, everyone was scared. I won't lie neither, my hands were shaking and a felt cold sweat trickled down my back. I was calming down when Mitch spoke, and what he said still echoes in my brain to this day. "'Kay? There's more of them." I remember when he said that I almost lost it. I rushed to the window and pushed my blinds aside. 5 deer, all in various states of duck-a-doopness, were slowly shuffling towards the yard from the tree line. My yard is almost entirely clear. A big flat area with some old playground stuff and a single big tree in the middle. Cliché, I know, but my mom loved the idea. Beyond the yard there was the tree line we laboriously kept clear of the yard. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of snow, and I saw those zombie deer shuffle through it. Slowly, sluggishly, so damn slow. Some of them were faster, but they would trip and fall in the snow, then they'd get back up and stumble on. But they didn't stop, no matter the horrible injuries they had. They just didn't stop. I looked at Mitch, he had gone pale. My mind started racing, I heard my heart beat and felt the adrenaline kick in. Okay, this is some Walking Dead shit. We gotta get some weapons or something. I snapped the blinds shut and went to my bed. Pulling the old knife I kept out. Police aren't going to be here for another hour or so if they even take us seriously. So everybody come with me. We crept to my dad's room, and even with all the lights on and the safety of the house, we tried to make as little noise as possible. I pushed open the closet door and pushed through my mom's junk to reach the gun safe. I typed in the code, struggling with my shaky hands. I had found the combo in my dad's notes app a few years back. Never thought I'd actually use it. I started handing boxes of bullets to Mitch and guns to Sam. Me and my dad always had a shared passion for firearms. I remember being excited every time Dad would come home with a new one. And my mom shaking her head and calling us names in Spanish. Soon the family arsenal was spread out on my dad's bed. Mitch picked up a shotgun, the one he always used when we went skeet shooting. Sam reached for a Colt R, carefully picking it up. I handed Anika another shotgun before shoving my grandpa's old pistol from World War II into my waistband. I hefted my dad's hunting rifle, an heirloom that he'd never let me touch. Mostly because it was supposed to be passed to me when I was old enough. I guess now was a better time than any. Considering it was the largest caliber on the bed. In the movies, whenever you see those montages of the heroes getting all their firepower out, it's always got this epic soundtrack, and you see the characters look invincible. Like they can take on anything. There was no soundtrack now, no epic music. Just a bunch of scared teenagers cramming bullets into oversized guns and undersized pockets. I realized we might have to go outside and told Mitch to retrieve cold weather gear from the closet. I had finished cramming my jeans with long fat rounds when I looked over at Danica. She was standing, frozen at the window. You could see a section of the tree line from my parents' room. I picked up a handgun and walked over to join her. At first, it looked like there was nothing out there. Just wind whipping the trees and snow. The shadows out in the trees were just the regular shadows. Until I looked closer. The whole ducking tree line was moving. Soon the others joined me. And I saw what I saw. Kay? Are we going to be okay? I heard Anika ask. Her voice was small, the outcast rebel was gone from her voice. She'd always been the bravest, always getting in fights and running from teachers. I looked at Sam, the football player and wrestler who loved Call of Duty and Bud Light was gone too. He looked like a little kid. Mitch, dependable mother ducker he was, just stared out at the trees like some wise wizard. I still have no idea how he managed to keep it together the best out of all of us. Danica, the popular girl who moved from Eastern Europe to escape war, looked like the war had reached her. It's funny how traumatic shit strips away people's masks. Reveals who they are. I guess it really isn't funny. But then again, I'm not an action hero, I needed therapy after all this was done. I needed lots of therapy. And I still sleep with a loaded gun under my bed. I remember watching the trees with my friends that day, it really helped though. If it were just me, I don't know what would have happened. I walked back to the bed and picked up more rounds for the rifle. Then Mitch joined me, he slung the shotgun over his shoulder and racked the bolt to my old hunting rifle. Sam started shakily slipping more rounds into the magazines for his R. When I look back on it now, we must have looked awesome. 5 friends against unnatural horrors. Like Stranger Things or IT. But right then it felt more like we were going to go fight Michael Myers with sticks and slingshots. Then Mitch started talking. Sam, grab a pistol, dude. Sam nodded and shoved one into his side pocket. "Kay, stop shoving those so deep into your pockets, doesn't your dad have like a satchel or something?" I nodded and pulled one from the closet. "You think we can drive out here?" He then asked when I returned. "I think, yeah, we should check the cameras to make sure the road is clear. There's so many out there, there might be more on the road." Anika then joined us, quietly staring at the bed. I walked over to her and handed her a box of shells. "Here, put these somewhere." She nodded and dumped the shells out before stuffing them into the pockets of her jean jacket. I showed her how to load the shotgun and handed her a revolver. I think it took us like 10 minutes to get all our shit together. But it felt like an eternity with those things crawling closer all the time. Sam bundled Danica up in a parka and snow boots. I pressed a Beretta into her hands with a few extra magazines. I let Sam try to reassure her and teach her how to use the gun. I cracked open my dad's computer and peered at the camera footage. It was grainy and washed out by the snow. But the gray night vision left very little up to the imagination. My driveway was spacious and closed off with low cobblestone walls. The front gate was wide open, and I could see the small road that led to the highway beyond. The snow showed a bunch of tracks. Long gashes in the white where broken feet had been dragged. "Duck." I breathed as I saw dozens of tracks leading from the road to the gate. I switched to the camera that showed the front of the house. "Duck," I exclaimed, catching Mitch's attention. He came over and gasped. "That's got to be at least 20, he said, watching as I switched the feed to the backyard. My blood ran cold as I saw what waited downstairs. The backyard was now packed with shuffling, decomposing bodies. They milled around the tree like regular deer, but they weren't picking at the roots or looking for plants under the snow. They just stood there. Dead eyes staring ahead. "You think a few shots will scare them off?" Mitch asked as I scanned the other cameras. "I don't know, dude, every camera has at least 5 on it. We've got more than 10 cameras." I looked at him, he was grimacing. "I think our best bet is to stay inside and hope they don't break in." I hate myself for speaking too soon. I really do, that whole thing where people say, "Don't jinx it." I did. I jinxed it so hard. Because the moment I said that, there was the sound of glass shattering. We all turned in unison at the closed door. I frantically switched between cameras. Finally, I found the one that had a view of the living room. The deer, the first one, had managed to smash through, at the cost of literally snapping its head off somehow. I started breathing heavily, watching as like moths to a flame the deer in the backyard turned towards the house and started to shuffle. Anika behind me started to laugh. It was low and deep, like an evil cackle. I turned towards her, watching as she racked the shotgun she was holding. "Some Walking Dead shit, huh?" She said it between bursts of manic laughter. I started laughing. Then Sam and Mitch. Until everyone was laughing except Danica, who looked at us like we were insane. Honestly, we probably were. I set the laptop aside and ran the bolt of my dad's rifle. "Let's kill some ducking zombie deer." I don't know who went out the door first, but I do remember who killed the first zombie deer. We were in the living room watching as the deer came closer, sofas overturned like makeshift barricades, and tables propped up against doors and windows. It was Danica, weirdly enough, she had grabbed a Colt rifle like Sam. It was big in her hands, and she held it awkwardly. The first deer that had died had been slowly picking its way up the deck steps when Danica's shot took it right in the crook of its neck. The poor thing was missing a jaw, and the noises it made when it fell were strangled and horrible. Then the rest of us started shooting. Most of it is a blur now. I remember my dad was right not to let me use his rifle when I was a kid. Because it bucked like a pissed off mule. Every shot blew massive holes into the shuffling deer, the noises they made going down like nothing I ever heard before. You know what they never show in movies? Guns are loud. Super loud. Imagine 5 of them going off in an enclosed house. My ears were ringing, and I could barely hear anything after the first few shots. But my body was on autopilot. I ran the bolt of that heirloom rifle like my life depended on it. I don't know why the deer kept coming. I don't know why anything that happened. Why they rammed against the remaining glass like zombies. Why they just kept coming, tripping over dead bodies and spazzing out on the floor before somehow pushing themselves up and seizing towards us. I remember sitting on the balcony that overlooked the living room, firing off bullet after bullet, watching as blood fountained out of ragged bodies like some sort of punctured balloon. I remember watching Mitch put a hole in the head of one deer and watching as it sank to the ground before being trampled by the others. I just kept shooting, barely feeling the .338 rifle smash into my shoulder every time I pulled the trigger. I was laser focused on the crosshair in my scope. My eyes barely registered anything but that little spot where the two lines crossed. All that time romping around the woods peering down that glass with my dad paid off. I just wish it were different. I wish a lot of things were different. I'm not a religious guy. Never went to church, but good God. After that night, I was thankful for whatever was watching over us that day. Thankful that the deer were too injured and too slow to reach us. Thankful we had enough bullets and guns. Thankful that after a while the police showed up. With the National Guard. I think I was down to my last two when I heard the helicopters. I saw the white spotlights play over the yard like fat circles of searing white. I saw the snow spray and the windows rattle as they flew over the house. I heard the chatter of machine guns, and we watched as the mass of deer outside our house turned into bloody chunks. I think we took the tables down off the front door and walked out into the front yard to the sight of soldiers in gas masks holding assault rifles everywhere. I remember I saw a guy who looked way too much like Special Forces walk up to me and start asking questions. He was tall and covered in gear. He kept asking if I knew where they came from and if I'd been bit. I don't really remember my answers, but most of what I said was to the effect of I don't know. He made me walk him through the events in the house and then the house itself. I think he was impressed by us, a bunch of teenagers managing to hold off an invasion of dead deer. When I managed to ask questions of my own, he responded with only a few words or less. Eventually he went off with some other Call of Duty looking guys in the direction of the trees the horde came from. A female cop sat down with me a few minutes later and looked me over. She asked a few questions, and I just kind of sat on the steps of my front porch. I remember saying very little, my hands shaking with adrenaline and anxiety. The female cop gave me a hug and left. I later learned that was the chief of police herself. Some paramedics checked me and my friends and said they had to take us to the hospital. I pulled some things out of my room, expecting to be there a while. I think a National Guard guy tried to take my rifle, but I couldn't let go of it. I don't know why. I had a death grip on the gun. It took 3 soldiers calmly talking to me to get the gun away, and even then it took a while. Everything was a daze then. They piled us into an APC of some sort and trucked us away. Anika sat next to me, staring at her vape pen. She chucked it out of the back when we started moving. I looked at my friends, all of us were dazed and shaky. Danica was playing with a pistol magazine in her hand while leaning on Sam, who was mumbling to himself. Mitch was just messing with his hair a lot. I sat there, feeling the uneven weight of my grandpa's pistol in my waistband and my knife in my pocket. During the battle, I had run out of rounds in the rifle and had pulled the pistol out, shooting down 2 deer through the window. I remember my dad telling me that his dad had used it in Pelelu. I pulled it out and just stared at it. It was older than me. Probably seen more horrors than me too. The cold metal was reassuring. I can't really describe why. It had protected my grandpa, and it protected me. I guess that's the best way to say it. I tucked it back into my waist. One of the soldiers with us was watching me. I could see his eyes through the gas mask. He just stared. I stared back. Eventually he nodded and looked away. I realized it was the dude that tried to take my gun. I guess he trusted I wasn't going to go nutso or something. Maybe he decided it was someone else's problem. I don't know. Adults are weird. Anika leaned on me. I kind of wrapped my arm around her. I've never been a fan of being physically affectionate with friends. But we both needed it that day. After everything had happened, we started dating. It's weird though, remembering that day. I really do like Anika, but I wouldn't have considered it if we hadn't gone through that. Things happen for certain reasons, I guess. Mitch likes to say that. He says it a lot now. When my parents got back, after the thousands of checks at the hospital, after talking to some soldier guys, then some police guys, then some definitely government guys, my dad had taken me out to eat. He asked only a few questions and told me he had watched the camera feed. He was proud. I looked like a Rambo, he said. I smiled. I didn't feel like smiling, but I did anyway. I didn't feel like eating the hamburger either, but I did anyway. My therapist says I might still be on autopilot. And he's probably right. I feel kind of numb sometimes. Like when I was just mindlessly racking the bolt and pulling the trigger. Watching something that should be dead die through the scope. I didn't feel like Rambo. I knew I did something important. No one really knows what happened though. The CDC and the other 3-letter agencies didn't say anything. I tried to look for any official report, but I couldn't find any. Even the news underemphasized the whole thing. Me and my parents had to sign an NDA for a bunch of other stuff. I looked everywhere online, but all I could find was an article by a conspiracy group that talked about alien experiments mutating the wildlife. The site also said Trump was an alien sent to guide humanity, so I don't know how relevant that source really is. Sharing this shouldn't come back at me, mostly because all the names are fake and anything really detailed was left out by yours truly. It's not really a traditional story either. I've tried to avoid any way anyone could tie anything back to me. Even the kids at school won't be able to figure it out, and even if they do, this is just a story online. How true can it be? My friends and I still hang out. We're tighter now though. As I said, me and Anika are dating. Mitch still goes hunting and shit with me and my dad, but now he's way better at it. He's always been too loud, sometimes I forget he's even there now. Danica weirdly stopped gossiping. She started running cross country, I think because when we fought the deer, she was kind of skinny and out of shape, and she lost her breath easily. Sam lost a lot of his old confidence. He still plays football and wrestles, but he's not so good. Whenever I'm at his place, I see a lot of biology and chemistry textbooks around. I think he's trying to figure out what happened to the deer. And honestly, I hope he does. The doctors and soldiers wouldn't say anything. Even the chief of police, who I talked to later, just told me that I had done a good job, but if she told me anything, she'd lose her job. I still wonder who that special forces guy was and if this is bigger than just that night. Given that they did a bunch of super specific tests in the hospital, I'm guessing they already know what it is. Or maybe they don't, it's confusing. Me and my friends don't have a clue what happened, and we don't want to know. We're happy just hanging out and doing the normal. Every time they're over at my new place though, paid for by the government, we always make sure to watch the windows. Truly a happening that I'm glad I wasn't alone for. I was lucky enough to have grown up on a Native American reservation in upstate NY. Was absolutely a great place to be a kid. And getting to learn about Native culture was such a lucky break. I'm white, the town had about 5,000 people, of which 2,500 were Native. Although I had to fight fairly often and rarely came out on top, I feel like it was the best way to grow up. Besides, it was mostly my big mouth that got me into fights, not that being white was looked down on. Also, because I grew up Native and was tested, I became an adult who knew himself and what really matters better than most. Anyway, back in the early 90s were my teen years, and I was the guy who could get kegs, so I was generally the one throwing the parties. And we partied often when school was out. There was not much to do out there and plenty of space to simply go unnoticed for the most part. One favorite spot was called the Point. Is where a creek meets the river? The Allegheny River is big and becomes the Ohio and then eventually becomes the Mississippi. Apparently the Point was a place that the Seneca tribe had been living at for as long as it existed. It makes sense with the river providing so much, and where the creek meets the river, it creates an impassable spot where the only way past would be to swim, and most of the year that includes a lot of risk. So as a natural gathering spot, it has been since glaciers melted at the last ice age. Today is corn fields and wilderness. Also many great fishing holes. I was with my high school sweetheart from age 16 till 28. She was valedictorian, I was a dropout. Unbelievably, she accomplished near perfection in school all the way to her PhD while drinking and experimenting with us losers who didn't have much responsibility. Frankly, for her to accomplish what she did while living with us duck-ups was amazing, and she deserves a ton of credit. She's still the most disciplined person I've ever met. Anyway, one night after an average-sized group of us socialized and drank cheap beer for hours, people went home, but I had a motorcycle that my girlfriend and I came on, and she and I were a bit drunk, so we decided to just sleep some of it off by the fire that we had burned all night long. It was just her and me. We were aware that we made an easy target for any bored rednecks to mess with, but I was armed, and we literally knew everyone who lived in the area, so we just didn't give a shit. We were just on the edge of the cornfield by the fire, there was a dirt road 20 feet from the corn, and the river was 20 feet past the road. The river is probably 150 yards wide at that spot, so it is big and creates a hell of a barrier. Well, 3 or 4 hours after we began to sleep around 4:30 am, we were awoken by what sounded like a compact car landing in the top of a big willow tree on the river bank. I mean, it was crazy loud. Stuff was thrown to the ground, some landed in the river. Turkeys sometimes could be found there, so was my first thought. But it was dark still, and whatever it was broke so much when it hit that tree that although I was surprised at how much noise wild turkeys made when landing, I was very familiar with turkeys, and this turkey would need to be the size of a bear to make such a crash into a treetop. My girl and I instantly woke and looked at each other as if to say, "You heard that also?" Shit, it must have really happened then. Then maybe 5 seconds after the initial landing in the tree, whatever it was crashed down the tree and was in the cornfield about 30 yards from us. It ran on real fast through the corn behind us in a half-circle shape from one side to the other at a speed a man could not match. Also, we could hear the corn whipping to the ground as it went through the field. I mean, the ears were slapping the ground as if being whipped like a bullwhip, thumping the earth very hard. Again, this was happening as if the thing in the corn was going 100 plus mile per hour. It was so fast and was just plowing through the corn 20 yards behind the two of us. We literally just held each other. We knew we were outmatched and that nothing we could do would defeat whatever it was that was doing such astonishing things so close to us. Clearly, it knew we were there and was capable of ending us both if I chose to. Lucky for us, we then heard it take back into the air and watched 2 red dots go over us, and then once over the river, it was gone. No sign of it remained or returned. We got the FCK out of there right then. If she hadn't been there with me, I'd have written it off as me having mental problems or something explainable. But we both experienced this thing and could completely back each other up. She will admit it to this day but would never bring it up. Her and I remain close friends all this time. She's a great lady, and I'm lucky to have a friend as long as she and I have been friends. Was before the Mothman movie and all the hype around that. And no tragic things happened in that area or in our lives after that experience. Not sure what it was about, but sure sounds like a Mozart type of experience. With the native connection, it seems even more like Mothman. That was 94 or 95. And was the only time anything remotely paranormal has happened to myself or to her also. Thank goodness she was there also, or I wouldn't be sure it happened. It was that crazy. Albert Usman's extremely strange encounter. This story is about 1924 and was told in 1957 and is one of the best first-hand eyewitness accounts of meeting otherworldly beings. Enjoy. I have always followed logging and construction work. This time I had worked over 1 year on a construction job and thought a good vacation was in order. BC is famous for lost gold mines. One is supposed to be at the head of Toba Inlet. Why not look for this mine and have a vacation at the same time? I took the Union steamship boat to Lund, BC. From there, I hired an old Indian to take me to the head of Toba Inlet. This old Indian was a very talkative old gentleman. He told me stories about gold brought out by a white man from this lost mine. This white man was a very heavy drinker. He spent his money freely in saloons. But he had no trouble getting more money. He would be away a few days, then come back with a bag of gold. But one time he went to his mine and never came back. Some people said a Sasquatch had killed him. At that time, I had never heard of Sasquatch. So I asked what kind of animal he called a Sasquatch. The Indian said, "They have hair all over their bodies, but they are not animals. They are people. Big people live in the mountains." My uncle saw the tracks of one that were 2 feet long. One old Indian saw one who was over 8 feet tall. I told the Indian I didn't believe in their old fables about mountain giants. It might have been some thousands of years ago, but not today. The Indian said, "There may not be many, but they still exist." We arrived at the head of the inlet about 4 p.m. I made camp at the mouth of a creek. The Indian had supper with me, and I told him to look out for me in about 3 weeks. I would be camping at the same spot when I came back. Next morning, I took my rifle with me but left my equipment at the camp. I decided to look around for some deer trail to lead me up into the mountains. On the way up the inlet, I had seen a pass in the mountain that I wanted to go through to see what was on the other side. Albert Usman talking to author John Green. I spent most of the afternoon looking for a trail but found none, except for a hogback running down to the beach. So I swamped out a trail from there, got back to my camp about 3 p.m. that afternoon, and made up my pack to be ready in the morning. My equipment consisted of one .30-30 Winchester rifle. I had a special homemade prospecting pick, axe on one end, pick on the other. I had a leather case for this pick, which fastened to my belt, as well as my sheath knife. The storekeeper at Lund was cooperative. He gave me some cans for my sugar, salt, and matches to keep them dry. My grub consisted mostly of canned stuff, except for a side of bacon, a bag of beans, 4 pounds of prunes and 6 packets of macaroni and cheese, 3 pounds of pancake flour and 6 packets of Rye King hardtack, 3 rolls of snuff, 1 quart sealer of butter, and 2 1-pound cans of milk. I had 2 boxes of shells for my rifle. The storekeeper gave me a biscuit tin. I put a few things in that and cached it under a windfall, so I would have it when I came back here waiting for a boat to bring me out. My sleeping bag I rolled up and tied on top of my pack sack, together with my ground sheet, small frying pan, and 1 aluminum pot that held about a gallon. As my canned food was used, I would get plenty of empty cans to cook with. The following morning I had an early breakfast, made up my pack, and started out up this hill. My pack must have been at least 80 pounds, besides my rifle. After 1 hour, I had to rest. I kept resting and climbing all that morning. About 2 p.m. I came to a flat place below a rock bluff. There was a bunch of willow in one place. I made a wooden spade and started digging for water. About a foot down, I got seepings of water, so I decided to camp here for the night and scout around for the best way to get on from here. I must have been up to near 1,000 feet. There was a most beautiful view over the islands and the strait, tugboats with log booms and fishing boats going in all directions. A lovely spot. I spent the following day prospecting. But no sign of minerals. I found a deer trail leading towards this pass that I had seen on my way up the inlet. The following morning I started out early, while it was cool. It was steep climbing with my heavy pack. After a 3-hour climb, I was tired and stopped to rest. On the other side of a ravine from where I was resting was a yellow spot below some small trees. I moved over there and started digging for water. I found a small spring and made a small trough from cedar bark and got a small amount of water, had my lunch, and rested here till evening. I made it over the pass late that night. Now I had downhill and good going, but I was hungry and tired, so I camped at the first bunch of trees I came to. I was trying to size up the terrain, what direction I would take from here. Towards west would lead to low land and some other inlet, so I decided to go in a northeast direction. Had good going and a slight downhill all day. I must have made 10 miles when I came to a small spring and a big black hemlock tree. This was a lovely campsite. I spent 2 days here just resting and prospecting. The first night here I shot a small deer. 2 days later, I found an exceptionally good campsite. It was 2 good-sized cypress trees growing close together and near a rock wall with a nice spring just below these trees. I intended to make this my permanent camp. I cut lots of brush from my bed between these trees. I rigged up a pole from this rock wall to hang my packsack on, and I arranged some flat rocks for my fireplace for cooking. I had a really classy setup. And that is when things began to happen. I am a heavy sleeper, not much disturbs me after I go to sleep, especially on a good bed like I have now. Next morning I noticed things had been disturbed during the night. But nothing was missing I could see. I roasted my grouse on a stick for breakfast. That night I filled up the magazine of my rifle. I still had 1 full box of 20 shells and 6 in my coat pocket. That night I laid my rifle under the edge of my sleeping bag. I thought a porcupine had visited me the night before and porkies like leather, so I put my shoes in the bottom of my sleeping bag. Next morning my pack sack had been emptied out. Someone had turned the sack upside down. It was still hanging on the pole from the shoulder straps as I had hung it up. Then I noticed 1/2 pound package of prunes was missing. Also, my pancake flour was missing, but my salt bag was not touched. Porkies always look for salt, so I decided it must be something else than porkies. I looked for tracks but found none. I did not think it was a bear, they always tear up and make a mess of things. I kept close to camp these days in case this visitor would come back. I climbed up on a big rock where I had a good view of the camp, but nothing showed up. I was hoping it would be porky, so I would get a good porky stew. These visits had now been going on for 3 nights. This night it was cloudy and looked like it might rain. I took special notice of how everything was arranged. I closed my pack sack, I did not undress, I only took off my shoes and put them in the bottom of my sleeping bag. I drove my prospecting pick into one of the cypress trees so I could reach it from my bed. I also put the rifle alongside me, inside my sleeping bag. I fully intended to stay awake all night to find out who my visitor was, but I must have fallen asleep. I was awakened by something picking me up. I was half asleep, and at first I did not remember where I was. As I began to get my wits together, I remembered I was on this prospecting trip and in my sleeping bag. My first thought was, it must be a snow slide, but there was no snow around my camp. Then it felt like I was tossed on horseback, but I could feel whoever it was walking. I tried to reason out what kind of animal this could be. I tried to get at my sheath knife and cut my way out, but I was in an almost sitting position, and the knife was under me. I could not get hold of it, but the rifle was in front of me. I had a good hold of that and had no intention to let go of it. At times I could feel my packsack touching me, and I could feel the cans in the sack touching my back. After what seemed like an hour, I could feel we were going up a steep hill. I could feel myself rise for every step. What was carrying me was breathing hard and sometimes giving a slight cough. Now, I knew this must be one of the mountain Sasquatch giants the Indian told me about. I was in a very uncomfortable position, unable to move. I was sitting on my feet, and one of the boots in the bottom of the bag was crossways with the hobnail sole up across my foot. It hurt me terribly, but I could not move. It was very hot inside. It was lucky for me this fellow's hand was not big enough to close up the whole bag when he picked me up. There was a small opening at the top, otherwise I would have choked to death. Now he was going downhill. I could feel myself touching the ground at times, and at one time he dragged me behind him, and I could feel he was below me. Then he seemed to get on level ground and was going at a trot for a long time. By this time, I had cramps in my legs, The pain was terrible. I was wishing he would get to his destination soon. I could not stand this type of transportation much longer. Now he was going uphill again. It did not hurt me so bad. I tried to estimate distance and directions. As near as I could guess, we were about 3 hours traveling. I had no idea when he started, as I was asleep when he picked me up. Finally, he stopped and let me down. Then he dropped my packsack. I could hear the cans rattle. Then I heard chatter, some kind of talk I did not understand. The ground was sloping, so when he let go of my sleeping bag, I rolled downhill. I got my head out and got some air. I tried to straighten my legs and crawl out, but my legs were numb. It was still dark, I could not see what my captors looked like. I tried to massage my legs to get some life in them and get my shoes on. I could hear now that it was at least 4 of them. They were standing around me and continuously chattering. I had never heard of Sasquatch before the Indian told me about them. But I knew I was right among them. But how to get away from them, that was another question. I got to see the outline of them now, as it began to get lighter, though the sky was cloudy and it looked like rain. In fact, there was a slight sprinkle. I now had circulation in my legs, but my left foot was very sore on top where it had been resting on my hobnail boots. I got my boots out of the sleeping bag and tried to stand up. I found that I was wobbly on my feet, but I had a good hold of my rifle. I asked, "What do you fellows want with me?" Only some more chatter. It was getting lighter now, and I could see them quite clearly. I could make out forms of 4 people. 2 big and 2 little ones. They were all covered with hair and no clothes on at all. I could now make out mountains all around me. I looked at my watch. It was 4:25 a.m. It was getting lighter now, and I could see the people clearly. They looked like a family, an old man, an old lady, and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. The boy and the girl seemed to be scared of me. The old lady did not seem too pleased about what the old man dragged home. But the old man was waving his arms and telling them all what he had in mind. They all left me then. I had my compass and my prospecting glass on strings around my neck. The compass is in my left-hand shirt pocket, and my glass is in my right-hand pocket. One tried to reason our location and where I was. I could see now that I was in a small valley or basin about 8 or 10 acres, surrounded by high mountains. On the southeast side, there was a V-shaped opening about 8 feet wide at the bottom and about 20 feet high at the highest point. That must be the way I came in. But how will I get out? The old man was now sitting near this opening. I moved my belongings up close to the west wall. There were 2 small cypress trees there, and this will do for a shelter for the time being. Until I find out what these people want with me and how to get away from here. I emptied out my pack to see what I had left in the line of food. All my canned meat and vegetables were intact, and I had 1 can of coffee. Also 3 small cans of milk, 2 packages of Rye King hardtack and my butter sealer half full of butter. But my prunes and macaroni were missing. Also my full box of shells for my rifle. I had my sheath knife, but my prospecting pick was missing and my can of matches. I only had my safety box full, and that held only about a dozen matches. That did not worry me. I can always start a fire with my prospecting glass when the sun is shining if I get dry wood. I wanted hot coffee, but I had no wood, and also nothing around here that looked like wood. I had a good look over the valley from where I was, but the boy and girl were always watching me from behind some juniper bush. I decided there must be some water around here. The ground was leaning towards the opening in the wall. There must be water at the upper end of this valley. There is green grass and moss along the bottom. All my utensils were left behind. I opened my coffee tin and emptied the coffee in a dish towel and tied it with the metal strip from the can. I took my rifle and the can and went looking for water. Right at the head of a cliff, there was a lovely spring that disappeared underground. I got a drink and a full can of water. When I got back, the young boy was looking over my belongings but did not touch anything. On my way back, I noticed where these people were sleeping. On the east side wall of this valley was a shelf in the mountainside with overhanging rock, looking something like a big undercut and a big tree about 10 feet deep and 30 feet wide. The floor was covered with lots of dry moss, and they had some kind of blanket woven of narrow strips of cedar bark, packed with dry moss. They looked very practical and warm, with no need of washing. The first day, not much happened. I had to eat my food cold. The young fellow was coming nearer me and seemed curious about me. My 1 snuff box was empty, so I relied it toward him. When he saw it coming, he sprang up quick as a cat and grabbed it. He went over to his sister and showed her. They found out how to open and close it. They spent a long time playing with it. Then he trotted over to the old man and showed him. They had a long chatter. Next morning, I made up my mind to leave this place, if I had to shoot my way out. I could not stay much longer. I had only enough grub to last me till I got back to Toba Inlet. I did not know the direction, but I would go downhill, and I would come out near civilization someplace. I rolled up my sleeping bag, put that inside my pack sack, packed the few cans I had, swung the sack on my back, injected the shell in the barrel of my rifle, and started for the opening in the wall. The old man got up and held up his hands as though he would push me back. I pointed to the opening. I wanted to go out. But he stood there pushing towards me, and said something that sounded like Soka, Soka. I backed up to about 60 feet. I did not want to be too close if I had to shoot my way out. A 30 might not have much effect on this fellow, it might make him mad. I only had 6 shells, so I decided to wait. There must be a better way than killing him in order to get out from here. I went back to my campsite to figure out some other way to get out. I could make friends with the young fellow or the girl, they might help me. If I only could talk to them. Then I thought of a fellow who saved himself from a mad bull by blinding him with snuff in his eyes. But how will I get near enough to this fellow to put snuff in his eyes? So I decided next time I give the young fellow my snuff box to leave a few grains of snuff in it. He might give the old man a taste of it. But the question is, in what direction will I go if I should get out? I must have been near 25 miles northeast of Toba Inlet when I was kidnapped. This fellow must have traveled at least 25 miles in the 3 hours he carried me. If he went west, we would be near salt water, same thing if he went south, therefore he must have gone northeast. If I then keep going south and over 2 mountains, I must hit salt water someplace between Lund and Vancouver. The following day I did not see the old lady till about 4 p.m. She came home with her arms full of grass and twigs and of all kinds of spruce and hemlock, as well as some kind of nuts that grow in the ground. I have seen lots of them on Vancouver Island. The young fellow went up the mountain to the east every day, he could climb better than a mountain goat. He picked some kind of grass with long, sweet roots. He gave me some one day, they tasted very sweet. I gave him another snuff box with about a teaspoon of snuff in it. He tasted it, then went to the old man, he licked it with his tongue. They had a long chat. I made a dipper from a milk can. I made many dippers, you can use them for pots too. You cut 2 slits near the top of any can, then cut a limb from any small tree, cut the back of the limb down the stem of the tree, then taper the part you cut from the stem. Then cut a hole in the tapered part, slide the tapered part in the slit you have made in the can, and you have a good handle on your can. I threw one over to the young fellow that was playing near my camp, he picked it up and looked at it, then went to the old man and showed it to him. They had a long chatter. Then he came to me, pointed at the dipper, then at his sister. I could see that he wanted one for her too. I had other peas and carrots, so I made one for his sister. He was standing only 8 feet away from me. When I had made the dipper, I dipped it in water and drank from it. He was very pleased and almost smiled at me. Then I took a chew of snuff, smacked my lips, and said, "That's good." The young fellow pointed to the old man and said something that sounded like oak. I got the idea that the old man liked snuff, and the young fellow wanted a box for the old man. I shook my head. I motioned with my hands for the old man to come to me. I do not think the young fellow understood what I meant. He went to his sister and gave her the dipper I made for her. They did not come near me again that day. I had now been here 6 days, but I was sure I was making progress. If only I could get the old man to come over to me, get him to eat a full box of snuff that would kill him for sure, and that way kill himself, I wouldn't be guilty of murder. The old lady was a meek old thing. The young fellow was by this time quite friendly. The girl would not hurt anybody. Her chest was flat like a boy's, no development like young ladies. I am sure if I could get the old man out of the way, I could easily have brought this girl with me to civilization. But what good would that have been? I would have to keep her in a cage for public display. I don't think we have any right to force our way of life on other people, and I don't believe they would like it. The noise and racket in a modern city they would not like any more than I do. The young fellow might have been between 11 and 18 years old and about 7 feet tall and might weigh about 300 pounds. His chest would be 50 to 55 inches, and his waist about 36 to 38 inches. He had wide jaws and a narrow forehead that slanted upward round at the back, about 4 or 5 inches higher than the forehead. The hair on their heads was about 6 inches long. The hair on the rest of their body was short and thick in places. The women's hair on the forehead had an upward turn like some women have, they call it bangs, among women's hairdos. Nowadays, the old lady could have been anything between 40 and 70 years old. She was over 7 feet tall. She would be about 500 to 600 pounds. She had very wide hips and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. Some of those lovable brasiers and uplifts would have been a great improvement on her looks and her figure. The man's eye teeth were longer than the rest of the teeth, but not long enough to be called tusks. The old man must have been near 8 feet tall. Big barreled chest and big hump on his back, powerful shoulders, His biceps on the upper arm were enormous and tapered down to his elbows. His forearms were longer than common people have, but well proportioned. His hands were wide, the palm was long and broad, and hollow like a scoop. His fingers were short in proportion to the rest of his hand. His fingernails were like chickens. The only place they had no hair was inside their hands, the soles of their feet, and the upper part of the nose and eyelids. I never did see their ears, they were covered with hair hanging over them. If the old man were to wear a collar, it would have to be at least 30 inches. I have no idea what size shoes they would need. I was watching the young fellow's foot one day when he was sitting down. The soles of his feet seemed to be padded like a dog's foot, and the big toe was longer than the rest and very strong. In mountain climbing, all he needed was footing for his big toe. They were very agile. To sit down, they turned their knees out and came straight down. To rise, they came straight up without help of hands or arms. I don't think this valley was their permanent home. I think they moved from place to place, as food is available in different localities. They might eat meat, but I never saw them eat it or do any cooking. I think this was probably a stopover place, and the plants with sweet roots on the mountainside might have been in season this time of the year. They seem to be most interested in them. The roots have a very sweet and satisfying taste. They always seem to do everything for a reason, wasting no time on anything they did not need. When they were not looking for food, the old man and the old lady were resting, but the boy and the girl were always climbing something or doing some other exercise. A favorite position was to take hold of his feet with his hands and balance on his rump, then bounce forward. The idea seems to be to see how far he could go without his feet or hands touching the ground. Sometimes he made 20 feet. But what do they want with me? They must understand I cannot stay here indefinitely. I will soon have to make a break for freedom. Not that I was mistreated in any way. One consolation was that the old man was coming closer each day and was very interested in my snuff. Watching me when I take a pinch of snuff. He seems to think it's useless to only put it inside my lips. One morning after I had my breakfast, both the old man and the boy came and sat down only 10 feet away from me. This morning I made coffee. I had saved up all the dry branches I found, and I had some dry moss, and I used all the labels from cans to start a fire. I got my coffee pot boiling, and it was strong coffee too, and the aroma from boiling coffee was what brought them over. I was sitting eating hard toast with plenty of butter on and sipping coffee. And it sure tasted good. I was smacking my lips, pretending it was better than it really was. I set the can down that was about half full. I intended to warm it up later. I pulled out a full box of snuff and took a big chew. Before I had time to close the box, the old man reached for it. I was afraid he would waste it and only had 2 more boxes. So I held onto the box, intending for him to take a pinch like I had just done. Instead, he grabbed the box and emptied it in his mouth. Swallowed it in one gulp. Then he licked the box inside with his tongue. After a few minutes, his eyes began to roll over in his head. He was looking straight up. I could see he was sick. Then he grabbed my coffee can, which was quite cold by this time. He emptied that in his mouth, grounds and all. That did no good. He stuck his head between his legs and rolled forward a few times away from me. Then he began to squeal like a stuck pig. I grabbed my rifle. I said to myself, this is it. If he comes for me, I will shoot him plumb between his eyes. But he started for the spring. He wanted water. I packed my sleeping bag in my pack sack with the few cans I had left. The young fellow ran over to his mother. Then she began to scream. I started for the opening in the wall, and I just made it. The old lady was right behind me. I fired one shot at the rock over her head. I guess she had never seen a rifle fired before. She turned and ran inside the wall. I injected another shell in the barrel of my rifle and started downhill, looking back over my shoulder every so often to see if they were coming. I was in a canyon and good traveling, and I made fast time. Must have made 3 miles in some world record time. I came to a turn in the canyon, and I had the sun on my left. That meant I was going south, and the canyon turned west. I decided to climb the ridge ahead of me. I knew that I must have 2 mountain ridges between me and salt water, and by climbing this ridge I would have a good view of this canyon, so I could see if the Sasquatch were coming after me. I had a light pack and was making good time up this hill. I stopped soon after to look back to where I came from, but nobody followed me. As I came over the ridge, I could see Mount Baker, and then I knew I was going in the right direction. I was hungry and tired. I opened my pack to see what I had to eat. I decided to rest here for a while. I had a good view of the mountainside, and if the old man was coming, I had the advantage because I was up above him. To get me, he would have to come up a steep hill. And that might not be so easy after stopping a few 30 to 30 bullets. I had made up my mind this was my last chance, and this would be a fight to the finish. I rested here for 2 hours. It was 3 p.m. when I started down the mountainside. It was nice going, not too steep and not too much underbrush. When I got near the bottom, I shot a big blue grouse. She was sitting on a windfall, looking right at me, only 100 feet away. I shot her neck right off. I made it down the creek at the bottom of this canyon. I felt I was safe now. I made a fire between 2 big boulders and roasted the grouse. Next morning, when I woke up, I was feeling terrible. My feet were sore from dirty socks. My legs were sore, and my stomach was upset from that grouse that I ate the night before. I was not too sure I was going to make it up that mountain. I finally made the top, but it took me 6 hours to get there. It was cloudy, visibility about a mile. I knew I had to go downhill. After about 2 hours, I got down to the heavy timber and sat down to rest. I could hear a motor running hard at times, then stop. I listened to this for a while and decided the sound was from a gas donkey. Someone was logging in the neighborhood. I told them I was a prospector and was lost. I did not like to tell them I had been kidnapped by a Sasquatch, as if I had told them, they would probably have said he is crazy too. The following day I went down from this camp on the Salmon Arm branch of Seashelt Inlet. From there, I got the Union boat back to Vancouver. That was my last prospecting trip and my only experience with what is known as squatches. I know that in 1924 there were 4 Sasquatches living, it might be only 2 now. The old man and the old lady might be dead by this time.